They said he came from the Rim, from a place the Sith no longer named. He spoke little, listened more, and when he first stepped onto the red sands of Korriban, he did not kneel. Not to the lords, not to the priests, not even to the dead. His name was not yet Tulak Hord. That name would come later, carved into stone, into fear, into memory. For now, he was just a stranger, one of many who crossed the void to chase power among the Sith. Most would die, he would not. Korriban was not a planet, it was a graveyard, and the Sith liked it that way. They believed death had a voice, that bones whispered truth when the living could not. The sky was always red, the air dry and bitter. Wind howled through canyons lined with broken statues. But it wasn't the wind that screamed, it was history. The stranger arrived alone, cloaked in a faded robe, face hidden beneath a cowl. His ship had no markings. Its engines hissed as if exhaling something final. He stepped down the ramp and did not look back. He had left everything behind. That was the first price. The Sith did not ask questions. They didn't care what you were, only what you could become. And if you failed to become something, the sand would take you. The stranger wandered the valley without a guide. Pilgrims were expected to beg for direction. He didn't. He slept beside tomb entrances, unmoving through cold nights. He studied old symbols etched in obsidian walls, watched Sith acolytes spar from a distance, tracking their movements like a predator watching prey. For weeks he spoke to no one, but the overseers noticed. His silence wasn't weakness, it was weight. There was something coiled beneath his calm, something not yet unwrapped. Not ambition. Not yet, but intent. Cold, precise, measured like a blade not yet drawn. One morning he was called. The temple of Naga Sado stood half buried in the sand, its entrance guarded by two stone serpents with broken eyes. Inside, the high overseer waited cloaked in black and red, flanked by twin Massacre guards. Their skin glistened like blood-polished stone. "Name?" the overseer asked. The stranger did not answer. "Name?" The voice rose, sharper this time. Still, nothing, only silence, calm, still as a corpse that hadn't begun to rot. One of the Massacre stepped forward, towering, snarling, ready to tear him apart. But the stranger raised his hand, slowly, open palm, not as a threat, not as a plea, just stillness. His fingers curled inward, slow as rust creeping across steel. The Massacre stopped. The air turned cold, the torches dimmed. Then, softly, the stranger spoke for the first time since landing. "I came to listen to the dead." The overseer blinked. Once. In the Sith tongue, that was not blasphemy. It was tradition. He was accepted. Not welcomed, never that. The Sith did not welcome. They endured, tested, survived. And the stranger, nameless still, was given a cell carved into the rock beneath the temple. No bed, no light, just silence and time. For months, he remained there. He ate what was left behind, drank from cracked jars, slept on stone, spoke to no one. But he was not idle. At night, he traced the veins in the wall, whispering ancient Sith code. In the dark, he meditated not to find peace, but to feel hunger sharpen. He listened, not for voices, but for the echo of something older than words. A promise, a calling, and beneath the stone, something answered. Korriban was carved by the dead. Long before the stranger arrived, Before even the first wars between Sith and Jedi, the ancients hollowed the planet's surface like bone. Tombs stretched for miles beneath the valley, built not to honor the fallen, but to imprison them. Some believed the tombs whispered at night. Others swore they changed shape, that those who entered did not always return the same way. But for the Sith, fear was part of the training. If you could not face the dead, you had no place among the living. The stranger entered his first tomb on the 21st day. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a rusted gate, sand-covered stairs, and the weight of breath turning cold the deeper he walked. The tomb of Ajunta Pao. Inside, time did not pass. Torches burned without smoke. The air smelled of blood that had never dried. Stone coffins lined the walls, each marked with forgotten language, etched so deeply the walls seemed to bleed shadow. Others had come before him, acolytes seeking glory, warriors hoping to awaken the power of the ancients. Most died, some vanished. A few returned mad, whispering names no one remembered. The stranger said nothing. He moved slowly, respectfully, not in fear, but in awareness, as if he knew he was being watched, not by spirits, but by something more dangerous, memory. At the heart of the tomb, he found it. Not treasure, not a weapon, but a door, heavy, sealed, marked with a symbol not found in any Sith archive. And next to it, bones. Not human, not Massacre, twisted, melted, as if they had screamed too loudly and were burned from the inside. The stranger sat beside them. He didn't touch the door, didn't try to open it. He just waited. Hours passed, maybe more. Then he rose and placed his palm against the seal. The door stayed shut, but something inside stirred. When he returned to the surface, the others noticed. His eyes no longer wandered. They locked. His footsteps made no sound. And when he passed the training halls, the other acolytes fell silent. Not from respect, from unease. He had spoken to a tomb and survived. After that, he entered more. The tomb of Marka Ragnos, where the force was thick like oil, and shadows clung to skin like bruises. The tomb of Simus, where a head once ruled without a body, kept alive by sheer will and cruelty. Each time, the stranger stayed longer. Each time, he came back, colder. Not once did he steal from the dead. He didn't need to. He was learning what they knew. Not through words, but through echoes. Lessons carved in blood, betrayal, and silence. He returned to his cell unchanged in appearance, but inside, something was shifting. A hunger that wasn't loud, that didn't roar or scream. It waited, like a sword sheathed in stone, knowing it would one day be drawn. The overseers debated. Some called for him to be tested. Others feared what testing might reveal. But in the Sith tradition, nothing was given. Everything was taken. And on the 44th night, he entered a tomb no acolyte was permitted to walk, the tomb of Tulak Hord himself. He was still nameless, still unproven. But something in him was beginning to awaken. Not just power, but identity. Not just darkness, but purpose. And the tomb did not reject him. Violence was the language of Korriban. For every lesson whispered in tombs, another was carved into flesh. The acolytes learned quickly that the force was only one weapon. The body was another. And in the training pits, mercy was considered a lie told by the weak. The stranger entered the pits for the first time without ceremony. Dozens of young warriors circled the arena above. watching from jagged balconies carved into the stone. Some cheered, some mocked. Others simply waited for the sand to drink new blood. It always did. His opponent was a Massacre-blooded initiate named Varak. Broad shoulders, thick arms, eyes full of cruelty, sharpened by years of being told he was born superior. The Massacre were ancient Sith descendants, bred for strength, often used as guards or warriors. Varak believed the fight would be easy. The stranger didn't think anything. He simply stepped forward, hands empty. A metal gong echoed through the chamber. Varak attacked first. His charge shook the sand. His roar filled the pit. He swung a heavy training blade meant to bruise, break, and remind lesser acolytes of their place. But the stranger did not move. He waited, still as stone, calm as the dead. Only when the blade neared his skull did he shift one step, small and precise. Varak missed by the width of a breath. Before the Massacre could recover, the stranger's hand slid across Varak's wrist and twisted. The blade fell. The scream rose. The crowd leaned forward. Not because he had disarmed Varak, because he had done it without anger, without fear, without even raising his voice. Varak lunged again, fists swinging like hammers, but the stranger's movements were quiet, efficient. He guided every strike away, redirecting the Massacre like a current shifting around stone. When Varak stumbled, the stranger pushed him into the sand not with strength, but with a single precise strike behind the knee. It wasn't domination. It was intention. And the overseers watching from above felt it. Varak rose for a final attempt, face twisted with rage. He grabbed a jagged rock from the sand, ignoring the rules. The crowd cheered. The stranger watched him approach, saw the desperation behind his fury. When Varak swung, the stranger caught his wrist, not harshly, just firmly. Then, in a slow movement, he turned the rock back toward Varak's own chest and held it there. A choice: surrender or death. Varak froze. For the first time, he saw not a rival, but a warning. He dropped the rock. The stranger let go. Silence rippled through the pits. No one expected restraint. The Sith believed victory meant ending the opponent. Blood was currency. Death was the lesson. But the stranger had shown something else, something older than Sith law. Control. Cold. Absolute. The overseer declared him the victor. The crowd didn't cheer. They simply backed away as he left the pit, as if touching him would invite something they were not ready to face. But the training pits did not stop for long. Days turned into weeks, and each match became a test. Not for him, for them. He fought acolytes older than him, stronger than him, more decorated than him. Some wielded vibroblades. Others used force-charged strikes meant to kill outright. He survived every fight. Not with brutality, with clarity. Each victory carved new whispers through the temple halls. They said he fought like someone who had studied every death in Korriban's history. Someone who listened to the ground before stepping on it. Someone who learned from the dead more than the living. Even the overseers grew cautious around him. He did not crave praise. He did not seek rank. He simply grew. Quietly. Steadily. Inevitably. And the pits that were meant to break him only sharpened the edge forming inside him, an edge that would one day cut deeper than any blade the Sith had ever forged. The Sith believed every warrior needed a master, someone to shape their anger, sharpen their instincts, and mold their future. But the stranger moved through Korriban like someone who had already been trained by something older than any living teacher. He woke before the suns rose. He meditated in silence long after others slept. He wandered the valley alone, tracing the edges of ancient statues, studying inscriptions that most acolytes ignored. When the overseers tried to assign him to a mentor, he refused without speaking a word. And for reasons none of them understood, they allowed it. He didn't need guidance. He needed direction. And he found it in the shadows of forgotten halls. Deep beneath the academy was a chamber sealed by age and fear. A place where the earliest Sith Lords stored weapons too dangerous for open use. Not artifacts of legend, those belonged in honored tombs. These were tools of war, crafted before the Sith understood the cost of power. Many believed the chamber had been emptied centuries ago. It hadn't. The stranger discovered it after weeks of wandering through the lower tunnels. A faint tremor in the force led him to a cracked doorway half buried in red dust. When he pushed it open, old air escaped, warm and heavy, as if the room itself had been holding its breath. Inside, the weapons waited. Rust-stained spears, curved blades with edges chipped by forgotten battles, crystals that pulsed faintly, their glow trapped beneath layers of grime. Most were useless, relics of a time when strength mattered more than precision. But at the far end of the chamber, resting alone on a stone pedestal, lay a sword. Not a lightsaber. A sword. Black metal, simple, unadorned, forged before the Sith learned subtlety. Its edges were straight, unbroken. Its hilt, wrapped in faded leather. It looked ordinary, unremarkable. Any other acolyte would have walked past it, searching instead for a weapon that radiated power or promised glory. The stranger didn't. He approached it slowly, as if the blade were a living thing, as if he recognized it. When he wrapped his fingers around the hilt, the room shifted. Dust lifted from the floor. The torches dimmed. And for a heartbeat, the force vibrated with something familiar, the echo of a long-dead lord who once wielded the blade in silence. This was not a weapon meant to shine. It was a weapon meant to end. He lifted it with one hand. It felt light, balanced, right. Not because it empowered him, but because it mirrored him. A blade without ornament, without a story, without a master. Like him. Outside the chamber, the academy stirred with the noise of training, commands, and distant screams. The stranger stepped into the light, the sword wrapped in old cloth, hidden beneath his cloak. Korriban's wind pressed against him, carrying the scent of sand and bone. He didn't return to the pits that morning. Instead, he stood at the edge of the valley, staring across the desert toward the tombs. The blade felt warm at his side, not with magic, not with memory, with possibility, as if it waited for the moment it would finally be drawn. Whispers spread through the academy. They said he had found a weapon no one else could claim, that the tombs had shown him something forbidden, that he walked with the same quiet certainty as the ancient lords who carved fear into the galaxy. None of them understood what was happening. He wasn't rising. He was awakening. Piece by piece, Korriban was shaping a name the galaxy would come to dread. That name had not yet been spoken, but the path toward it had already begun. In the tombs, in the pits, in the silence only he could hear. The sword at his side was waiting, and soon it would have a master. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no permission asked. One morning before the twin sons of Korriban had fully risen, Tulak Hord stood at the edge of the canyon, staring at the gates carved into the base of the cliffs. The trial had no set time, no fixed rules. It waited in silence for those who believed they were ready. But the gate never opened easily. It demanded blood. Tulak stepped forward alone. No overseers followed. No peers accompanied him. This was not tradition. This was necessity. He had risen through the ranks of the acolytes too quickly, without a master, without a sponsor, without even speaking his name. The others whispered that he was cheating the path, that no one advanced this fast without something dark burning behind their eyes. They were right. He approached the gate and placed his hand on the stone. It was warm not from the sun, but from what lay beneath, trapped within. The doors were etched with countless handprints, burned into the surface by generations of Sith initiates. Some had passed through, many had not. Tulak didn't speak. He pressed harder. The gate didn't move. Then, with a steady breath, he drew a thin blade from beneath his cloak and dragged it across his palm. Blood spilled across the stone. The gate shuddered not in response to the blood itself, but to what followed, the stillness, the acceptance. He did not flinch. He did not bandage the wound. He let it drip into the sand. Then, the gate opened. Not with noise, not with power. It simply yielded, as if the stone recognized something in him. Something old. Beyond the gate, a narrow corridor stretched into the mountain's heart. The walls were lined with skeletal remains, not decorations, but warnings. Some clutched their own throats. Others had been torn apart. These were not symbols, these were failures, and now Tulak walked among them. He descended without hesitation. The trial of bones was not a duel. It was not a battle. It was survival against what should not be awakened. A test passed down from before the great hyperspace war. Buried beneath layers of tradition and cruelty, it was said to reflect the will of the planet itself, the living tomb. He reached the first chamber before the blood had dried on his hand. Inside, light flickered from no source. The air turned colder. The dust shifted beneath his boots, as if something breathed beneath it. From the shadows came a hiss, low, wet, and close. The first trial had begun. Creatures older than memory crawled out from the cracks Sith spawn left behind by ancient alchemists. Limbs twisted, eyes blind, flesh that had never stopped mutating. They didn't hunt for food. They hunted for movement, for force presence. Tulak did not ignite a saber. He had none. He reached for the sword he had taken from the vault, the blade without a name. Steel against nightmares. When the first creature lunged, he moved low, fast. Not with rage, with patience. He drove the blade through its throat, twisted once, and turned before the next could reach him. 3 more followed. He fought without speaking, without calling on the force. Only steel, breath, and the weight of each step. By the time the last one fell, his cloak was torn, his shoulder bled, his sword dripped black fluid. But his eyes did not waver. The tomb watched him, and for a moment it seemed to pause as if weighing what he had done. Then the floor beneath him shifted, revealing a staircase that led deeper. He did not rest. He descended. The trial was not over. It had only begun. The staircase led to silence. Not absence of sound, true silence. The kind that pressed against your skull, thick and unnatural. A silence that had weight, that made breath feel wrong, that made the force itself grow cold. Tulak descended without pause. The walls around him narrowed. Carvings etched in a language even the Sith had forgotten pulsed faintly with old energy. None glowed. but the lines felt alive, as if they listened, as if they remembered. This part of the tomb was not built for ceremony. It was built for containment. At the base of the stairs, the path opened into a massive chamber swallowed in shadow. The ceiling was lost in blackness, the floor cracked with age. And in the center, a stone platform hovered suspended by nothing, floating in the void like a final thought. Tulak stepped forward, each footfall quiet. The bridge to the platform was thin, no railings, barely wider than a handspan. One mistake would mean falling into a darkness that did not echo, where no scream would ever return. He did not hesitate. Each step was slow, measured, his balance perfect. Halfway across, the force shifted. Not violently, not in warning, but in recognition. Something old had awakened. The shadows stirred. From above, a shape dropped silent, heavy, fast. It landed behind him. Not a beast, not a spawn. A Sith, or what had once been one. Dressed in robes eaten by time, its skin gray, stretched thin across bone. Its eyes burned with a pale, unnatural flame. It did not speak, it didn't need to. This was no enemy summoned from hatred or hunger. This was a sentinel left behind by ancient hands to test those who passed. Tulak did not turn. He listened, waited. Then, in one motion, he pivoted, blade drawn, stance grounded. The sentinel struck first. Faster than any creature he had fought before. Its strikes were not wild, they were trained, precise. Sith combat techniques from a time when every movement was meant to kill. Tulak blocked, but barely. Metal clanged against metal. Sparks lit the void. Each time he parried, the edge of the platform shifted beneath him. There was no space for error, no room for doubt. He drew on the force, but only slightly, not enough to dominate. Just enough to guide his instincts, to slow the world for one heartbeat at a time. The duel stretched on. Neither spoke, neither yielded. But something inside Tulak began to change. Not panic, not exhaustion. Realization. This was a memory. The sentinel wasn't just a guard. It was a mirror. A reflection of what he could become: power without identity, motion without purpose. A relic trapped in endless obedience, buried in silence long after the galaxy had moved on. That would not be his fate. With a final strike, Tulak disarmed the figure. His blade hovered at its throat. The sentinel did not resist. It waited. Tulak stepped back, lowered the weapon, and watched as the sentinel slowly crumbled, not in defeat but in release. Its form collapsed into dust, drifting into the void like breath, leaving a body for the last time. The platform pulsed. The silence broke. A voice, ancient, low, neither male nor female, whispered from the stone. "You remember." Tulak did not answer. He stepped forward as the bridge vanished behind him. The path no longer mattered. The tomb had accepted him. The darkness did not resist his presence. It embraced it. And in that moment, for the first time, Tulak Hord understood something the others had not. The Force did not belong to the Jedi, or the Sith, or to any temple, creed, or code. It belonged to those who endured what the darkness kept, and walked out unchanged. The platform began to lower, not with sound, but with the soft pressure of the air shifting around him. The void retreated as stone walls rose again, closing him inside a narrow descent, lit only by a faint red glow. Tulak's grip tightened around his blade, but there was no fear in him. Only awareness, only focus. He could feel the tomb watching, not as a place, as a presence. Every step forward carried weight, like the air thickened with each breath. He reached the base of the corridor and found himself in a circular chamber, smaller than the others. No beasts waited here. No guardians, just a single doorway at the far end, carved with symbols that twisted the longer he looked at them. This was the part of the trial, meant to break the mind. The Sith called it the blade behind the eyes, a test without claws or teeth, where the enemy was thought itself. Tulak stepped inside. The temperature dropped. Darkness swallowed the chamber. He stood still, but the floor beneath him blurred. His senses dimmed, then sharpened, then dimmed again. Time stretched thin. Seconds bled into minutes, or maybe hours. The force wavered like a flame in a storm. Then, whispers. Not loud, not clear, just fragments. His own voice. A voice he wouldn't remember. A voice he had forgotten. A voice that should not exist. He did not turn. He did not search for their source. He simply listened. The chamber shifted. Walls melted into shadow. The ground pulsed beneath his boots like a heartbeat, and before him appeared shapes blurry, silhouettes barely formed, like memories pulled halfway into reality. They circled him. Slowly, quietly. Voices layered over one another. You do not belong here. You will break. You are alone. You will die nameless. Tulak breathed once, slow, controlled. He had heard words like these before, long before Korriban, in places without stone, without tombs, without power. He had survived them then. He would survive them now. The shadows stepped closer. One took form. Not a monster, not a Sith spawn. A man, tall, hard eyes. A face Tulak should have known but couldn't place. A face carved in anger, disappointment, something sharper. The silhouette stepped forward and raised a blade, not steel, not metal, but something woven from darkness itself. Turn back, it whispered. Tulak did not. He closed his eyes. And the chamber changed again. Now he stood in the training pits. Alone. Sand beneath him, cold air around him. But something was wrong. The sky was black. The walls were broken. Blood pooled across the ground, but no bodies remained. The wind carried a scent that did not belong on Korriban, one he had not smelled in years. A memory. The tomb was forcing him to remember what he buried. He didn't fight it. He let the memory come. A flash of light, a roar of anger, a figure falling, a hand reaching toward him before going still. Pain without shape, loss without name, a decision that could not be undone. The chamber wanted him to relive it, to drown in it. But Tulak did not break. He stepped through the vision as if walking through smoke. The silhouettes dissolved, unable to anchor themselves. The chamber flickered again, revealing the true room behind the illusions. A single pedestal waited. On it, nothing. It wasn't offering him a prize. It was offering him truth. That the only enemy worth fearing was the one that lived in silence, the one that spoke without sound, the one that waited behind the eyes. Tulak bowed his head for one quiet breath. Then he walked past the pedestal. The illusions did not return. The whispers went silent. The darkness receded. He had conquered the trial meant to break his mind. And as he stepped into the next corridor, something followed him, not a curse, not a blessing, but a clarity sharper than steel. He would never be broken from within. Not by memory, not by fear, not by the Force itself. The final chamber was silent. Not in the way the tomb had been before. This silence was heavier. It pressed against the skin, sank into the lungs. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of judgment. The trial had one last gate. No inscriptions, no symbols, just a wall of solid stone that hummed with faint vibrations. It had no hinges, no visible way to open. But it was alive with the Force, old, heavy, waiting. Tulak stood before it, blade still at his side. His steps no longer echoed. The floor beneath him felt soft, like the tomb itself had grown tired of stone, as if the ground had become ash. Then the wall spoke, not with words, but with memory. Images flooded his mind. Wars, ancient, forgotten, battles between lords whose names had long since faded from the galaxy's records. He saw Sith carving lightning through armies of Jedi. He saw temples fall, planets burn, voices scream and vanish into space. And then he saw himself, not as he was, as he could become, wearing armor blackened by age, a cape dragging across marble floors, thousands kneeling, one standing defiant, a blade in his hand, red with betrayal, power beyond imagining, loneliness deeper than any tomb. It was not a vision. It was a choice. The wall trembled, and in that moment, Tulak understood. The trial was not about victory. It was about surrender. Not to weakness, to transformation. To pass through the gate, something had to die. Not his body, his former self. He lowered his weapon, unwrapped the cloth from its hilt. Then, slowly, he placed the sword on the ground and stepped back. The air grew cold. The Force surged through the room like a breath drawn in reverse. The wall cracked, not wide, just enough for him to pass. On the other side, there was no audience, no overseers, no acolytes waiting to cheer or mock, only an empty chamber lit by a single shaft of light from above. In its center, a stone basin filled with dark water. He approached it without hesitation. The surface rippled, and in its reflection, he saw not his face, but his name. Not spoken, not written. Felt? Tulak. It did not explain itself. It did not need to. The name was not given. It had always been there, waiting to be remembered. He reached into the basin. The water was warm, alive. It clung to his skin like oil, like memory. When he pulled his hand free, it was clean. The cut across his palm, the one he had opened to enter the gate, was gone. The tomb had taken his blood. Now it returned something else. He turned without a word and stepped back through the broken wall. Behind him, the crack sealed. The trial was complete. But he was not the same man who had entered. Something had been stripped away, the part of him that still questioned, that still hesitated, that still feared whether he belonged here. He no longer doubted. He didn't speak of the trial when he returned to the surface. No one asked. They saw it in his eyes. In the way, the ground seemed quieter beneath his feet. In the way the Force no longer flowed around him, but bent ever so slightly in his presence. He had survived. He had endured, but more than that, he had changed. And nothing, not stone, not silence, not blood, not even the past survives this place untouched. By the time Tulak Hord claimed his name, the war had already begun. Not a war of armies, not one the Sith publicly acknowledged. This was a conflict buried in whispers, a rebellion that took root beneath the temples, in the broken ruins of older sects and older lies. They called themselves the Red Cult, but they were not Sith. They were Jedi. Or, they had been. Cast out for crossing lines the Jedi refused to bend, exiled to the Outer Rim, abandoned in the wake of the 100-year darkness. Some had fallen to madness, others to hunger. But a few had remained intact, bitter, quiet, watching. They didn't believe in balance, or codes, or the purity of the light. They believed in revenge. And in secret, they rebuilt. Not in the cities, not in the stars, but in the dust in caves carved beneath the sands of Relge and the valleys near Korriban's edge. Far enough that no Sith Lord cared to look. Close enough that they could feel the tremble of the old tombs. They studied what the Jedi forbade, practiced what the Sith discarded. They bled themselves to speak with forgotten spirits. They carved crimson runes into their skin. They tore the Force apart to reshape it in their own image. They didn't want power. They wanted erasure. Tulak Hord learned of them the way he learned everything through silence. He noticed acolytes disappearing, overseers lying, missions that ended with no record. There were gaps in the archives, places redacted, names deleted, but the absence of truth was itself a shape, a hole too clean to be natural. He traced the pattern across old star charts, cross-referenced temples built before the Great Schism, looked for fractures in the Force places where the current broke unnaturally, and there he found them. Beneath the valley of the Golg, hidden under a collapsed fortress, the Red Cult had returned. They called themselves the True Flame. They believed the Force was a wound, not a gift. And they planned to burn the Sith from within. At first, Tulak said nothing. He observed, waited, let the cult grow arrogant. Let them think they remained unseen. He watched them infiltrate the lower levels of the academy, corrupt weaker acolytes, steal relics from sealed tombs. One of their leaders had even disguised himself as an archivist feeding false visions to initiates, turning their minds inside out. The council debated. Some believed the cult would burn itself out. Others feared the repercussions of open war. But Tulak had already decided. He would not wait for permission. This would be his first conquest, not for rank, not for title, but for certainty. Because in his eyes, the Red Cult wasn't a threat. It was a challenge. A test left by the Force itself. And Tulak Hord did not run from trials. He consumed them. The first strike came at midnight. A flare of lightning from the high cliffs ignited the eastern ridge. By morning, half the cult's outer watchposts were ash. Tulak didn't lead legions. He brought 7 acolytes. 6 would not survive the week. But he never expected them to. Their purpose was to hold the line, to distract, to bleed the outer walls. His purpose was singular. He would enter the heart of the cult alone. Not to negotiate, not to intimidate, to end it. And beneath the cracked stones of the Red Temple, in shadows soaked with stolen blood, a lesson waited. Not for him, for history. Because Tulak didn't come to destroy their teachings. He came to erase the memory that they ever existed at all. The Red Temple was not a monument. It was a scar. Carved into the cliffs north of the Sith Academy, hidden beneath layers of collapsed stone, the temple had no surface entrance. It had once belonged to a forgotten offshoot of Dark Jedi who fled the Great Schism and tried to merge Sith alchemy with Jedi clairvoyance. They failed. The temple was sealed. But the foundation had remained intact, buried, waiting. The Red Cult didn't build it. They awakened it. When Tulak Hord reached the threshold, the force rippled, not with resistance, with anticipation. He walked through the rubble without drawing his blade. His cloak dragged through the dust. Red light flickered from torches mounted on bone-wrought sconces. The air was thick with decay, not just of bodies, but of truth. The kind of rot that came from years of silence, from rituals repeated too many times without meaning. The cult had taken root deep in the temple's core, rebuilding its chambers into sanctuaries of pain. Every wall was etched with symbols meant to break the mind. Every hallway carried echoes of screams trapped by alchemical rites. Tulak felt them brush against his thoughts. Not memories, not voices. Imprints of torment, weaponized to turn fear into obedience. He did not waver. He descended. Past mummified bodies seated in silent circles, mouths sewn shut with red fiber. Past pools of coagulated blood, still vibrating with low whispers. Past a corridor filled with hundreds of open eyes carved into the walls, not symbols, but actual eyes, kept alive by Sith magic, watching endlessly. Still, he descended. The heart of the temple pulsed ahead, a chamber veiled by thick incense, lit only by crimson flames that gave no heat. At its center stood the High Flamekeeper, the last surviving founder of the Red Cult. He had once been a Jedi Knight. His name had been erased. What remained was a man hollowed by ideology, bloated by stolen power. He welcomed Tulak with open arms. "You came alone," the Flamekeeper said. His voice was calm, measured, as expected. Tulak did not answer. He stepped into the circle. Surrounding them were the cult's most trusted 7 lieutenants, each bound by oaths that twisted their minds into a single will. Their faces were hidden behind bone masks, their bodies thin, veined with red light. They moved not with steps, but with purpose, ready to strike, ready to die. Still, Tulak said nothing. The Flamekeeper gestured toward the basin in the center of the room. "Drink, and we will show you what the Sith have forgotten. We do not fear death. We do not fear pain. We are the true shape of the Force." Tulak removed his hood. Then, slowly, he knelt. The cult stepped forward, believing he had yielded. That was their final mistake. In a single breath, the Force surged. Not like a wave, like a blade. The air screamed. One of the masked lieutenants exploded backward into the wall. Another collapsed, lungs crushed from within. The third tried to scream, but his throat collapsed before the sound could leave. The ritual chamber erupted in chaos, not from battle, but from precision. Tulak rose through the smoke, his blade unsheathed. No emotion, no fury, just movement. He didn't strike to wound. He didn't pause to threaten. Each swing of his sword carried finality. Each gesture with the Force crushed a life. Within seconds, 5 were dead. 2 ran. The Flamekeeper staggered, blood trailing from his mouth. "You were supposed to understand," he whispered. Tulak's eyes were still. "I did." Then he struck. The Flamekeeper fell without sound. His body hit the stone floor, soft as dust settling on an untouched tomb. For a moment, the chamber was still. No breath, no motion. Only the distant hum of the temple's ancient heart echoing through the walls. Then the Force shifted. Not gently, not subtly. It convulsed. As if the temple itself recoiled at what had been done. The remaining lieutenants ran deeper into the inner sanctum, vanishing through a corridor lined with broken pillars. Their fear was loud, trembling, desperate. It left a trail in the force that Tulak could follow with his eyes closed. But he did not pursue immediately. He stood over the Flamekeeper's corpse, studying the old man's face one final time. There was no peace in death, only release. Tulak turned away. The chamber doors slammed shut behind him as he entered the long hall. Not by hands, by will. The cult was activating every defense the temple still remembered. Runes lit up beneath layers of dust. Air rippled, the temperature spiked, and the walls began to bleed shadows. Dozens of red-robed acolytes poured toward him from the far end of the corridor, their screams warped by rituals that had hollowed them from the inside. Their force signatures were twisted neither light nor dark, something broken between the two. They moved with frantic devotion, brandishing blades etched with blood-soaked symbols. Tulak lifted his hand. The first wave flew backward as if yanked by unseen hooks, slamming into the pillars with enough force to crack bone. He didn't pause, didn't breathe. He waded through them as if through water. His blade carved arcs of silver against the red glow of the temple, each strike precise, final, unhurried. The cult fought without formation. They lunged like wounded animals. Tulak cut them down like memories he no longer needed. When the last acolyte fell, the torches along the walls flickered. The temple groaned, shifting as if to bury itself again. Stones rumbled. Sand poured through cracks in the ceiling. But Tulak didn't stop. He followed the trail of the two fleeing lieutenants through a passage that spiraled downward, deeper than the maps of the old archives, deeper than even the Sith dared to dig. The air grew dense, heavy, toxic. Here, the force pooled in stagnant pockets. The walls glistened with residue left from years of rituals that had gnawed at reality itself. Tulak stepped carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for whatever had been trapped here long before the cult's arrival. At the bottom of the corridor stood a massive door. It opened before he touched it. Inside was a chamber unlike the others, circular, sunken, with a pit in its center filled with crimson mist that pulsed like a beating heart. The last two lieutenants stood at its edge, chanting, their voices rising in frantic unison. They planned to unleash something they believed could stop him. Something even the Sith had chosen to forget. Tulak didn't give them time. He strode into the chamber, the mist curling around his boots. The air vibrated with unstable energy. His blade flashed. One lieutenant fell, throat open, his final chant swallowed by blood. The other turned, hands burning with crimson fire, and hurled it toward Tulak with a scream that cracked the stone. Tulak raised his palm. The fire didn't reach him. It collapsed inward, devoured by an invisible pull. The lieutenant stared, horrified, feeling his power unravel. Tulak didn't advance. He didn't need to. He simply closed his hand. The lieutenant's body hit the ground. Silence returned. Then the pit began to change. The mist thrashed, rising in jagged streaks. The chamber shook. Whatever the cult had been feeding for decades stirred in violent hunger. But Tulak wasn't afraid. He stepped to the edge and gazed into the red fog. It recoiled. For the first time in years, the force inside the pit retreated. Tulak didn't need to destroy it. His presence alone was enough. When he turned away, the mist dimmed, shrinking into the pit like a wounded animal retreating into its den. The last sanctuary of the red cult had been broken, and the night the force burned red became the night it finally went dark. The dawn rose over Korriban, but no one noticed. The sun did not shine, It bled through clouds of red dust and ash, settling over the temple valleys like smoke from a fire that had no source. The wind carried the scent of scorched stone. Distant echoes lingered in the canyons, fading too slowly. Tulak Hord emerged from the base of the cliffs alone. No words, no wounds, only silence. The red cult was gone. Not scattered, not defeated, erased. The temple that had once pulsed with stolen rituals was now buried again, not by war, but by will. Tulak had collapsed it from within, sealing its secrets under a mountain of stone. There would be no survivors, no records, no graves. The Sith Council never asked how he did it. They only asked how long it took. 3 days. They asked how many followed him. 7. They asked how many returned. None. And Tulak said nothing more. He did not claim victory. He did not request reward. He returned to the academy in silence, walked past the overseers, past the acolytes who lowered their eyes now, not in hatred, but in fear. He returned to the cell he had never left behind, the cold walls still carved with lines of language only he could read. He sat. He meditated. And he waited. For what? No one knew. But the silence around him deepened. Something had shifted. It was not his strength. It was his certainty. He no longer needed to prove himself to the Sith. He had proven something else, something older, something none of them had yet understood. That true power was not measured by how much destruction you could cause. It was measured by what you could remove without leaving a trace. The Red Cult had believed they could reshape the Force. Tulak had shown them that the Force could choose to forget them. In the months that followed, artifacts belonging to the cult were quietly removed from the vaults. Their symbols were scraped from walls. Their teachings burned. The Sith did not say the name Red Cult again. Not because they feared it, because they no longer remembered it. Tulak Hord had made sure of that. One day, an archivist opened a scroll thought to contain one of the cult's final rituals. The words were missing. Not redacted. Gone. Vanished from the parchment as if never written. Even memory had begun to yield. It was the first sign that Tulak Hord's influence was not bound to battles or blades. It reached deeper into the past, into perception, into the Force itself. And yet, he did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. The destruction of the Red Cult had not made him stronger. It had revealed how far he still had to go. He had tasted erasure, understood its silence, wielded it like a blade. But he had not yet become it. He was still flesh, still breath, still bound by limits. That would change. He knew now what the Sith had forgotten. That legacy was not survival. Legacy was disappearance. And those who could make the galaxy forget would never be forgotten. He rose from his meditation and wrapped the cloth once more around his sword. Not as a weapon, as a memory, one that would be needed soon. Because the Red Cult was only the beginning, and the path ahead would not be paved with battles. It would be paved with silence, the kind that buried temples, the kind that erased names, the kind that remained long after all others were gone. The dead do not build empires, but Tulak Hord was no longer fully among the living. He had risen through the dark, survived what others could not name, and in the silence that followed, he began to shape the world around him. Not through conquest, not through diplomacy, through structure, through stone, through the architecture of fear. The fortress had no name in the beginning. Only a location. A jagged plateau on the windswept plains of Dromund Kaas, blackened by storms, wrapped in roots that clawed up from the world's crust. The Sith had long avoided it. They said the ground was cursed, that voices rose from its caves at night, that the Force didn't flow there, it trembled. Tulak chose it for that reason. He didn't want peace. He wanted stillness. A place where power could be shaped without distraction. It began with a single foundation, carved directly into the rock. No blueprints, no guidance. Just his vision etched into the minds of slaves and architects until they dreamed in spirals, angles, and blood channels. The walls were built from volcanic stone. The ceilings lined with metals that shimmered with a faint crimson hue, reacting to pain in the air. The gates were wide enough for war beasts, but designed so no sound could escape them once closed. Every corridor turned inward. Every room had no corners. No space for secrets. No place for rest. The fortress was not designed to be entered. It was designed to hold things. And over time, it became known by a dozen whispered names. The Spiral Hold, the Black Mouth, the Fortress of Chains. It grew fast. Too fast. Within a year, it stretched across a quarter-mile of jagged terrain, with holes reaching deep beneath the surface. Entire wings were abandoned before completion, as if even Tulak's mind could not maintain their presence for long. Doors that no one remembered building appeared and vanished. Sometimes screams echoed through newly placed walls before the stone had dried. Tulak did not stop construction. He adapted. The fortress itself was becoming alive, not sentient, but resonant. It reacted to his presence, shaped its spaces according to his mood. When he entered the meditation sanctum, the temperature dropped. When he spoke commands, walls shifted subtly to carry his voice. When he shed blood, the floor absorbed it. The Sith Council noticed. Some came to inspect. None stayed long. They praised the structure, admired its power. But something about it unsettled them. They couldn't explain it. They didn't need to. Tulak preferred they didn't return. He was not building a seat of government. He was building a monument to control. A citadel not only of stone, but of function. Every scream heard within its walls served a purpose. Not to punish, to instruct. He captured beasts from unknown worlds and caged them in rotating chambers. He brought failed apprentices and taught them truths that made them claw at their own minds. He bled rituals into the stone until the very structure became a conduit, a place where the Force could be pulled, bent, and broken without resistance. No one knew how deep the lower levels extended. Not even Tulak. He let the fortress grow like a root system down, not out. Some speculated he was feeding it. Others believed the fortress was feeding on him. But none of them understood what he was truly doing. He was not making a home. He was making a wound. One the galaxy would never fully close. There were no windows in the Fortress of Chains. Light was a choice, not a necessity, and Tulak Hord chose darkness. Not complete, just enough to make the eye question, just enough for the mind to imagine what might be watching. It was said that those who spent too long inside the fortress began to whisper, even when alone. Not out of fear, but because the walls were always listening. Tulak didn't design it that way. He simply allowed it. It started with the meditation chamber, a domed room buried beneath the central spire, surrounded by 7 concentric rings of stone. Inside, there were no symbols, no furniture, no artificial light. Just space, breath, and presence. Tulak would sit in silence for hours, sometimes days, eyes closed, mind open. And slowly, the room began to change. First, the acoustics shifted. Whispers spoken in the outer halls would carry softly into the center, not echoes, memories. Then, patterns began forming in the stone beneath his feet. Cracks that weren't there before. When traced, they formed lines, circles, scripts from languages he'd never learned but somehow understood. The Force was shaping the room. Not as a tool, as an extension. He tested it. He thought of fire and felt heat rise in the floor. He remembered death and heard the air shift behind him. He whispered a name and the room held it, repeated it, and then let it go. It wasn't just alive. It was listening. Tulak expanded the design. He reshaped the halls to mirror the meditation ring, repeating curves, layered rooms, spaces that folded in on themselves like thoughts turning inward. The more complex the design became, the more the fortress responded, not with violence, with awareness. Doors would open before he reached them. Torches lit before he spoke, but only for him. Others were not so fortunate. Slaves began going missing. They wandered into corridors that weren't there the day before. Some came back days later, shaken, aged, their eyes unfocused. Others never returned. The fortress did not kill them. It lost interest in them, as if it decided they no longer served a purpose. Tulak did not grieve them. He studied them. He brought scholars from Zayast to observe the anomalies. They charted the holes, sketched the symbols, mapped the resonance fields. One called it a miracle of Sith alchemy. Another declared it a fracture in time. A third went mad before he could share his conclusion, scratching lines into the walls with his own nails until his voice gave out. Tulak recorded all of it. He wrote not in books, but in stone, carving his findings into the inner walls of the vault chamber beneath the central core. He believed the Force was not merely power. It was behavior. It responded to discipline, to fear, to clarity, and the fortress had become the perfect mirror for it. In time, the lower halls became sanctified, not holy, just sacred to the dark. Rituals were conducted without voice. Screams echoed not in pain, but in revelation. Tulak no longer needed words to command his apprentices. They obeyed when he looked at them. They fell to their knees when he entered the room, because they understood what the walls already knew. That Tulak Hord had stopped seeking power. He was now shaping it. And the rooms that learned to listen would one day speak for him. Pain was not a punishment in the fortress of chains. It was a language, a way of shaping the Force, a way of teaching the body to listen, a way of bending the mind until it understood truths too sharp for words. Tulak Hord did not invent this language. The Sith had practiced it for generations, but he refined it, perfected it, wove it into the fortress until every stone carried echoes of agony, purpose, and memory. The first chamber built for this purpose was small, bare, circular, a single iron ring embedded in the ceiling, another bolted into the floor. The walls were smooth at first, untouched, but that changed quickly. Every lesson left a mark. Nails scratched patterns. Knives carved symbols. Claws tore lines of desperation that later bled into meaning. The sounds that filled the room were not screams. They were insights being forced into existence. Tulak didn't torture for pleasure. He didn't torture for cruelty. He tortured for revelation. To him, Pain stripped away false strength, the kind built by pride, fear, or ambition. When the fortress stripped someone down to their core, Tulak examined what remained. Some found clarity. Others found emptiness. A few found madness. Tulak accepted all outcomes. He believed the Force did not speak clearly until everything else was silent. The walls agreed. Over time, the pain imprinted itself into the stone, not as sound, as feeling. When an apprentice entered the chamber, the walls responded, sometimes with shivers, sometimes with warmth, sometimes with pressure that wrapped around the ribs like a hand refusing to let go. The fortress remembered. It remembered every plea, every breath, every final heartbeat. And it did not forget. Tulak expanded the design. The second chamber was larger, with 7 pillars marking 7 stages of suffering: exhaustion, confusion, fear, surrender, awakening, clarity, and rebirth. Apprentices were made to walk the circle, touching each pillar, letting the energy seep into their skin. Some collapsed before reaching the third. Others screamed before touching the fourth. A rare few made it past the 6th. Only one reached the 7th. Tulak watched that apprentice rise, trembling but transformed. He said nothing. The walls whispered for him. A low hum, like the breath of an immortal creature settling deeper into the stone. The apprentice bowed and wept, not from pain, but from understanding. The fortress had accepted him. Tulak knew then that the structure had reached a new threshold. It no longer reacted only to him. It reacted to potential. When the council visited again, they walked the halls with pride and caution. They admired the strength of the defenses, the precision of the architecture, but they avoided the lower chambers. They did not ask what happened there. They did not want to know. One lord asked Tulak why he had built so many rooms for ritual. Tulak answered simply, "Power grows best where it bleeds." The lord never returned. Rumors spread across Drummond Cass, whispers of a fortress where walls pulsed with memory, where the force itself felt heavier, as if weighed down by the echoes of suffering. Some said the fortress was alive. Others said it was haunted. A few believed it was a wound in the planet, bleeding energy into the world around it. Tulak did not deny any of it. He didn't need to. He walked the halls each night, tracing the grooves left by hands that no longer lived. He listened to the way the stone shifted as it breathed. He felt the force coil around him, thick and responsive. But it was here in the chambers of pain that the first cracks formed. Not in the stone. In Tulak. He found himself lingering longer after each ritual, listening to echoes that did not belong to the living, feeling presence where none should exist. The fortress whispered to him now, not just as a tool, but as a companion. And Tulak began to understand a truth he had never wanted to face. Pain was no longer something he commanded. It was something that followed him. There was no ceremony when Tulak Hord claimed the throne. No coronation, no vow, no oath before the council. He simply entered the throne chamber one morning, walked to the center of the room, and sat. And no one questioned him. The chamber had been carved from a single block of obsidian, polished smooth but left unfinished in places as if it still remembered being stone. The throne itself was not ornate. No jewels, no banners. Just black iron twisted into shape by the force alone. It rose from the floor like a scar, as if it had forced itself up through the foundation. It suited him. Tulak rarely spoke while seated there. Those brought before him often waited in silence, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. unsure whether they were being judged, studied, or forgotten. But that throne, it changed something. Not in the others. In him. He began to feel the fortress listening even more closely. He could sense the echoes before they arrived, the thoughts of others brushing his mind like dust in the air. At times, he heard whispers when no one was present. At other times, he felt a pressure building beneath the throne room, a weight, a pull, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. At first, he dismissed it. He believed the strain was natural. His connection to the Force had deepened beyond anything the other lords could understand. His fortress had become an extension of his will. If the air trembled, it was because he commanded it. If the walls whispered, it was because they remembered him. But late at night, after the torches dimmed, Tulak began to notice something different. The temperature shifted, his skin prickled, and beneath his seat of power, the stone began to hum. He ordered excavation. Quietly, his most trusted architects tore through the floor beneath the throne room, layer by layer. They uncovered ancient designs not part of the original fortress, spirals, symbols, patterns etched into the rock long before his rise. The energy leaking from the cracks was not raw. It was focused, old, waiting. At the very bottom, buried under 8 meters of black stone, they found a door. Not one of Tulak's making. Not Sith. Not Jedi. Something else. It bore no hinges. No seams. Only a single circle carved in its center, the same shape Tulak had traced in the meditation chamber years before, when the fortress first began to listen. The circle pulsed when he touched it. No sound, no light, just a feeling. Recognition. He ordered the chamber sealed again. Not out of fear. Out of instinct. Whatever lay beneath had already shaped part of him. Now it was reaching again. And for the first time in many years, Tulak felt uncertain. The throne no longer sat above stone. It sat above a question. One he didn't yet want to answer. He returned to the upper halls, continued his conquests, oversaw rituals, buried rivals beneath his silence. But something had shifted. When he sat on the throne, the whispers grew louder. When he walked the halls, the walls grew colder. And at night, he dreamt of chains. Not binding others, binding him. The fortress had been his weapon, his sanctuary, his reflection. But now, it had become a mirror that did not blink. Tulak still ruled, still commanded. But deep beneath the throne, the crack remained, and it was growing. Power had changed him. Not in the way others feared, not with arrogance, not with cruelty. Tulak Hord had never needed to boast. His power did not shout. It weighed, it waited, and now it pulled. He had conquered armies, broken cults, built a fortress that breathed with the dark side. But conquest was never the goal. It was a step, a trial, a tool. What he sought now could not be found in war. It lived in the silence beneath understanding, in places the Sith feared to look. He wanted more than strength. He wanted knowledge, the kind buried before language, the kind sealed by those who went mad trying to explain it. He began to withdraw from the outer world. His armies continued to expand under the banners of his command, but Tulak himself remained deep within the fortress of chains. Beneath the throne, beneath even the torture halls, alone, in the oldest chamber, he sat in a circle drawn with his own blood, surrounded by relics he no longer remembered stealing. Shards of Sith tablets from Ziost, dried hands of failed alchemists, the preserved vocal cords of a Jedi seer who had spoken prophecies backward before cutting out her own tongue. He wasn't studying them. He was listening. And slowly, they began to speak. Not in sound, not in words, but in impressions, bursts of sensation, heat, pain, patterns of pressure that formed meanings he could only half endure. His mind stretched to hold them, then recoiled like muscle torn too far. He bled from his nose, his ears, once his eyes, but he did not stop. This was not meditation. This was descent. He stopped using his name, not because he feared losing himself, but because he believed names could not survive what he was becoming. The Sith around him noticed the change. Some whispered of sorcery, others of sickness, but none approached. Not anymore. His presence in the Force had grown unstable. To stand near him was to feel nausea, pressure, disorientation, like standing beside a crack in reality. They called it corruption. He called it understanding. He began to draw strange diagrams, not with ink, but with shadow. His hands moved through the air and left marks. Floating glyphs that flickered between dimensions, visible only to those trained in the deepest Sith rituals. The fortress began to echo with them. They appeared on walls, in water, in flame. Some apprentices who looked too long at them began to change. One began repeating every sentence spoken to him, in reverse. Another starved himself, claiming food no longer tasted real. A third carved a spiral into his chest and walked into the lower catacombs without fear or light. Tulak did not intervene. He was beyond concern. He spoke now only to one thing, a presence that stirred beneath the fortress, deeper than the rituals, older than the Sith. It had no voice, only rhythm. It pulled at his mind during meditation, appeared in his dreams, not as image or sound, but as absence of void that took shape by what it erased. He realized what it was offering. Not power, not immortality, continuity. A state beyond decay, beyond sleep, beyond memory. But there would be a price. To learn the ritual, Tulak would have to break himself, tear the last human fiber from his being, rip out the need for rest, for dreams, for identity. The others believed he was falling. He knew he was preparing, because what he had found was not a spell. It was a path, and it could not be walked by someone who wished to return. It was not called a library. It had no shelves, no catalogues, no doors. But Tulak Hord called it that because there was no better word. A place where knowledge was kept, but never read, only endured. It existed beneath the fortress of chains, far below the throne, deeper than even the blood-soaked ritual chambers. A vault without shape-shifting, growing, breathing. He had not built it. He had uncovered it. The door appeared one night as he slept in meditation. Not a vision, not a dream. A physical archway, carved into the stone behind his chamber wall where nothing had been before. There was no lock, no guards, only a single word carved into the frame in a language he did not recognize but understood. Return. He entered without hesitation. Inside, the air was heavy, pressed down like weight in the lungs. The space had no size. It bent with each step, walls stretching or closing depending on thought, not memory, not movement. Thought. And everywhere voices, but not as sound. They filled the air like pressure. They spoke in ideas, not words. Each one was a presence, buried deep in the stone, trapped, sleeping, echoing. Some were Sith, others were not. Some had names, Most had long since lost them. Tulak began to record them. Not with writing, with memory. He sat for days in silence, letting the presence of the library wash over him. Each voice touched a piece of his mind. Some left nothing. Others carved themselves into his thoughts like scars. He felt their deaths, their regrets, their final spells spoken too late, their rituals left incomplete. The library held every Sith who had failed to ascend. Every Jedi who had crossed too far and never returned. Their names could not be spoken. Their fates could not be copied. But Tulak could feel them. And that was enough. He began to construct a system, a mental index of pain, madness, sacrifice. He categorized their wisdom not by what it could do, but by what it cost. Some teachings were easy to access, but left the user blind for days. Others would rewrite your memories. Others would open something that could never be closed. He memorized them all. He began to change. His voice grew quieter. His eyes darker. He no longer responded to titles. No longer acknowledged the passage of time. Those who served him noticed that his shadow moved even when he didn't. That his reflection had started to lag behind him by several seconds. He brought no one to the library. He never spoke of it. But every night he returned. And each time he stayed longer. He sought a name, not for himself, for the ritual. A name buried in the library's core beneath the failed spirits, beneath the fallen lords, beneath the Force itself. It had once belonged to a Sith who attempted to split their soul across time, surviving by echo alone. The attempt had failed, but the name remained, unspoken, waiting. Tulak found it. Not by chance, by suffering. He recited the names of every voice in the library in perfect silence until his breath stopped and his heart began to fade. He drifted close to death, not to escape life, but to hear what only the dying could hear. And in that stillness, the name revealed itself. He could not repeat it. He could not record it, but he could carry it. He left the library that night changed. The ritual was now his, but so was the weight of every soul that had failed before him. He didn't fear the price. He feared what it meant that he was willing to pay it. The ritual could only be performed once, not because it was fragile, because it broke everything it touched. Tulak Hord chose the night without telling anyone. No apprentices were summoned. No scribes called to record the event. The fortress itself seemed to know. Its halls grew quiet. The air pressed inward, thick with something unsaid. Torches dimmed not from lack of flame, but from restraint, as if even light feared what was coming. He descended alone, past the throne, past the chambers of pain, past the hidden library, deeper than any Sith had gone before. He walked until the walls stopped following rules, until the corridors bent in circles, until time blurred a place not meant to exist in the galaxy's order. And there, at the bottom of the fortress, he found the chamber. He had seen it once before. In a vision, a sphere of jagged stone suspended over a pit of black water, floating, turning slowly, covered in thousands of markings carved from the inside, a language older than the Sith. Not designed to be read, designed to be endured. The air inside was dead. No sound, no breath. Tulak stepped into the sphere. It closed behind him. There were no windows, no doors, no light. The only thing that existed was the space between his heartbeats, and then that stopped too. The Force pulled inward. not from above, from within. He dropped to his knees, not in reverence but in necessity. His body collapsed under the weight of the ritual. It had begun before he realized. The name he had taken from the library was unfolding inside him, piece by piece, syllable by syllable. It was not a word. It was a weapon. Every part of him, his memories, his fears, his pride was split, examined, and burned. He tried to breathe. Nothing came. Not pain. Not panic. Only silence. And then he began to see. Not with eyes. With memory. Every life he had taken stood before him. Every scream he had ignored echoed again. Every apprentice he had abandoned. Every rival he had destroyed. Every piece of himself he thought he had buried came forward not to accuse, but to be unmade. The ritual did not kill. It peeled. Stripped. It tore the soul into fragments, like threads unraveling from the center. Tulak felt the moment his name was erased. The Force no longer recognized it. He no longer recognized it. He reached forward, not with his hands, those had stopped responding, but with will. He clung to one truth. He had chosen this. And the Force, for a moment, relented. Not out of mercy. Out of respect. The sphere opened. The silence broke, and Tulak Hord stood, barely. Breathing. Alive. Changed. The ritual had not given him power. It had taken his weakness. He no longer needed rest. No longer dreamed. He did not feel hunger, or time, or emotion in the way others did. His body lived. But his soul no longer belonged fully to this plane. He had crossed into something else. Not immortality. Continuity. And with that came silence. The kind that follows a scream that never ends. He returned to the fortress with slow steps. Those who saw him could not speak. Not from fear, from confusion. He looked the same. But the force around him had changed. It no longer flowed through him. It bent away. As if it knew something had happened inside him that could not be reversed. Tulak did not explain. He could not. The ritual had taken his voice. Not the one he used to speak. The one he used to be. The days after the ritual felt wrong. Not to Tulak Hord. To the fortress. The halls reacted first. The walls that once whispered now held their breath. Torches that bent toward him before now flickered away. Even the chains embedded into the ceilings once rattling softly at his passing hung still, as if unwilling to acknowledge him. Tulak noticed none of it. He walked without sound, without hurry, without the natural rhythm of a living body. He did not tire. He did not hunger. His pulse slowed until it barely registered. His skin cooled. His reflection dulled. And yet, he remained unbroken, alive, present. It was everything he had wanted. And everything he had not understood. His first sign came during meditation. He sat in the center of the fortress's primary chamber, surrounded by 8 circles carved with ancient Sith symbols. For years, they had pulsed in response to his presence. They flared when he drew the force, dimmed when he rested. Now, nothing. Tulak reached inward, past his thoughts, past sensation, past memory. But the force did not answer. It recoiled. It wasn't gone. He could still feel its shape like a warm current beneath ice, but whenever he reached for it, something in him pushed it away. Something cold, something silent. something born the night his soul was torn apart. He opened his eyes. The chamber remained unchanged. But he had changed. The Force would no longer hold him the way it once did. Not because he had lost touch with it, because he had stepped outside it. He rose, slower than usual, not from fatigue, from disorientation. Sensations returned out of order, balance first, then vision, then breath. His body healed too quickly, too cleanly. A cut closed before he saw the blood. A bruise vanished before he felt it ache. He had wanted strength beyond death. Instead, he had been given a body that refused to die. A curse disguised as survival. One night, a young apprentice approached him in the lower halls, trembling, shaking, barely old enough to speak clearly. He whispered that he had seen something in the meditation chamber, a flicker of Tulak's shadow breaking apart, as if it were no longer attached to him. Tulak said nothing. He reached out with the Force, not to heal, to silence the memory. But the apprentice didn't react. Tulak's hand hovered over his mind, yet the Force refused to obey. It twisted, slipped, reversed. For the first time in his life, Tulak felt the Force resist him. Not as an enemy, as if it did not recognize him. The apprentice collapsed in terror, not from attack, but from the emptiness that spilled off Tulak's presence, a void where power used to live. Something that did not breathe, yet moved. Did not feel, yet chose. Tulak walked away. He did not kill the boy. He didn't need to. Fear would finish what he could not. In the following weeks, he stopped sleeping entirely. He tried. Hours passed with his eyes closed, perfectly still, but his mind did not dim. Rest did not come. Dreams did not form. Instead, the silence grew, deepened, spread. He began to forget simple things: the smell of burning incense, the feel of cold stone beneath his palms, the taste of water. His mind held memory like cracked glass. Some pieces stayed, others slipped through. And yet, his power grew. Not through rage, through detachment, through absence, through the space his soul once occupied. He could bend stone with a gesture, shatter bone with a whisper, crush wills without raising his voice. But none of it felt real, none of it felt earned. His body lived. His power thrived. But Tulak Hord himself was fading, not dying, changing. The ritual had saved his body from age, from weakness, from time. But it had cost him something greater. His dreams, his rest, his connection to the living Force. He walked through his fortress as a man who could not die and slowly realized the truth. He was no longer meant to live. His name has been lost, not erased, buried, not by time, but by fear. Tulak Hord never spoke it again, not after the end, not after the blade. But once long ago, that name held meaning, authority, even promise. Because before the betrayal, he was Tulak's greatest creation, the only apprentice who survived the deeper chambers, the only one who learned not by fear, but by understanding. He watched everything, too closely. Most apprentices looked at Tulak and saw strength. He saw the cracks. He noticed the slow changes, the way Tulak no longer slept, the way his body moved with precision but not urgency. He noticed the way his voice grew softer, how his gaze lingered too long on nothing. He saw the distance, the space between who Tulak had been and what he was becoming. Others believed it was evolution. The apprentice believed it was erosion. He studied Tulak's teachings obsessively, reconstructed them in private, refined them. He created new interpretations, adjusted stances, altered incantations, rearranged rituals to minimize cost. He didn't just copy his master, he prepared to replace him. Not with hatred, with intent. He believed the Sith could not evolve until Tulak fell. And he believed it was his responsibility to make that happen. Tulak knew. He had known for some time. There is no such thing as a secret in a fortress that listens. The walls told him. They whispered the apprentice's name as he passed. They showed Tulak the patterns, the repeated visits to forbidden chambers, the stolen texts, the moments when the apprentice stood still too long in his presence, measuring distance, posture, response time. Tulak didn't stop him. Because Tulak wanted to see. He wanted to see what he had made. One night, he invited the apprentice to the upper chamber, a place used only for reflection, never for combat. A ring of cold stone, open to the red sky, lit by 4 flames that burned without heat. Tulak stood in the center and said nothing. The apprentice arrived slowly. No hesitation, just respect. He bowed, once the kind of bow given before a final act. And Tulak nodded. The room went still. No audience. No guards. Just 2 Sith, and the truth between them. The apprentice stepped forward, slowly drawing the blade Tulak had once given him. A gift from his first conquest. Folded metal, etched in lightning scars, a weapon meant to bind them. It would be the weapon that broke them. Tulak did not raise his hand. Not yet. He studied the boy he had raised in silence. The boy who had never failed. The boy who had survived the chambers that twisted others into shadows. He did not see hate in his apprentice's eyes. He saw purpose. And something colder. Pity. That was when Tulak understood. This was not ambition. It was mercy. The apprentice believed Tulak had become something that needed to be ended. Something no longer tethered to life. Something that lingered where it should have faded. The apprentice didn't want to rule. He wanted to release. Tulak stepped forward. For the first time in years, he felt heat rise through his chest, not anger. Memory. Because once, he too had stood in a chamber like this, blade in hand, facing a master who no longer heard the Force clearly. Once he had believed he could bring clarity through death. Now he stood on the other side. And the blade that had created him was ready to unmake him. The first strike came without warning. A clean, silent cut through the air, fast enough to kill any Sith who relied on instinct alone. But Tulak Hord didn't move by instinct anymore. His body leaned aside an instant before the blade passed. Not from speed, but from inevitability. He had seen this moment long before it arrived. The apprentice pressed forward. His footwork was perfect, measured, precise, balanced. Every step carried the teachings Tulak had given him over years of brutal lessons, sleepless nights, and silent trials. There was no wasted motion, no emotion, only discipline. Tulak blocked the second strike with the back of his hand, redirecting it with ease. Not effort, ease. The apprentice adjusted immediately, transitioning into a downward arc toward Tulak's ribs. Tulak pivoted again, letting the blade fall through empty air. He wasn't fighting. He was observing. And the apprentice felt it. "Stop watching me," he hissed, striking again. Tulak didn't answer. The fortress answered for him. The torches dimmed, Shadows lengthened, stretching across the floor like dark fingers reaching toward the duel. The room tightened, not physically through pressure, through the weight of the force bending around Tulak as if the air itself knew which way the fight should tilt. The apprentice didn't stop. He spun into a sweeping strike aimed at Tulak's legs. Tulak stepped over it. The blade rose toward his throat. He tilted his head. A slash came for his shoulder. He leaned back, every movement calm, effortless, detached. The apprentice grew desperate. "You trained me for this," he said, voice cracking beneath the rhythm of their fight. "You wanted this." Still, Tulak did not speak, because the apprentice was right. This was the lesson, not from Tulak to him, from the force to Tulak. The apprentice pressed harder. His blade carved sparks from the stone floor. His strikes became sharper, faster, fueled by conviction rather than rage. For a moment, just a moment, Tulak saw the boy he had once found in the lower pits. A child who survived by calculating every weakness, every breath, every shadow. A child who had become a man strong enough to challenge a legend. For the first time since the ritual, Tulak felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not anger, something older, the faint pull of the living force, thin as smoke, fragile as memory. He almost reached for it. Almost, but the ritual's void pulled him back. The apprentice saw the hesitation. He attacked. A downward slash aimed at Tulak's collarbone, brutal, final. Tulak caught the blade between two fingers. The metal shrieked. The apprentice froze, eyes wide. Tulak twisted his wrist. The blade tore free from the apprentice's hand and spun across the floor, clattering into the dark. The duel could have ended there. But Tulak stepped back. He allowed the apprentice to retrieve the weapon. A gift, a warning, a lesson. The apprentice picked it up with shaking hands. The shadows flickered across his face, fear, sorrow, admiration, and something darker beneath it all. He dropped into a stance Tulak had never taught him. A new form, sharper, crueler, designed not to challenge, but to kill. Tulak paused. For the first time, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not just ambition, not just discipline, not just the instinct to overthrow a master. Tulak saw creativity. The apprentice had not only learned from him, he had surpassed part of him. And in that moment, Tulak understood the truth behind their duel. This was not about power. It was about legacy, about what he had built and what he had broken. The apprentice raised his blade. Tulak opened his hands. The room fell completely silent, and the real duel began. Outside the chamber, the night was still. Kars City slept beneath a canopy of storm clouds. Lightning rolled across the sky, but the thunder never came. The stars had vanished. Only darkness remained wrapped around the fortress like a closing fist. And inside, Tulak Hord stood face to face with his own creation. The apprentice moved first. Again. But this time, Tulak met the strike. Not with a block, not with evasion. With intention. The air cracked, their blades collided with a force that shook the stones beneath their feet. Tulak's strength had not faded, the force had not abandoned him. It had simply changed. And now, it moved through him like ice through broken glass, jagged, cold, and without sound. The duel became something else. Not a contest of skill. A conversation. Strike, parry, step, breath. Every movement spoke of everything unspoken. Every clash echoed every lesson. The apprentice's form was a map of Tulak's teachings, every pivot, every angle. But what made him dangerous was what Tulak had not taught him. He fought with rhythm, with flow, with something new. He adapted mid-strike, reversed feints, broke patterns before they formed. Tulak saw himself and more than himself, something refined, sharper, but not whole. Not yet. The duel carried them across the stone floor, over ancient carvings worn smooth by footsteps long forgotten. The firelight caught the sweat on the apprentice's brow. His breathing grew heavier, but his eyes stayed locked. Tulak's eyes, by contrast, were still, not from calm, from distance. He was no longer fully present. His body moved. His blade answered. But his spirit remained just beyond the veil, adrift in the echo of the ritual that had left him less than mortal. The force bent around him unnaturally, like light around a hole in space. And the apprentice began to notice. His strikes slowed. His footwork hesitated. The questions he had buried beneath his ambition rose again. What was he fighting? A man? A ghost? Tulak pressed forward for the first time. One step, then two. His blade hummed low, not from energy, but from memory. The weapon remembered blood. It remembered war. It remembered who it served. The apprentice tried to match the rhythm. But Tulak wasn't fighting with rhythm anymore. He was fighting with inevitability. Strike, disarm, advance. Block, turn, break the stance. The apprentice faltered. One cut along the ribs. A second across the forearm. Tulak didn't strike to kill. He struck to teach. To remind. To warn. The apprentice staggered backward. His breathing broke. He tried to lift his blade, but it shook in his grip. He looked up, truly looked, and saw what stood before him was no longer a Sith Lord. It was the weight of everything Tulak Hord had done. And everything he had become. The apprentice lowered his blade. Not in surrender. In comprehension. He understood now. Tulak could be challenged, but not yet replaced. The silence returned between them. Heavy. Absolute. And then, Tulak spoke. For the first time that night. Just two words. Not ready. Not as judgment. As fact. The apprentice closed his eyes. Tulak stepped past him. No celebration. No punishment. The duel was over. The lesson complete. But something inside both of them had shifted. Tulak had seen the future. The apprentice had seen the cost. Neither would forget. And the night the master was challenged would be remembered as the night the master survived. The apprentice did not move as Tulak Hord walked past him. Not out of fear. Out of certainty. He knew he had failed, not because his skill was lacking, not because his resolve had faltered, but because Tulak was still something he could not yet comprehend. Something beyond strength, beyond sorcery. Tulak had become a presence the apprentice could touch with his blade, but not reach with his will. And that made him dangerous. Not as a rival. As a reminder. Tulak paused at the far end of the chamber. The torches flickered, bending toward him like dying stars bending toward gravity. The fortress felt colder now, more aware, as if it too had witnessed the duel and chosen not to intervene. Behind him, the apprentice steadied his breathing. He looked down at his blade, cracked in two places, chipped along the edge. It had cut mountains, slain beasts, carved its way through the deepest chambers of the fortress. But against Tulak it had splintered. He tightened his grip. A blade that breaks, he whispered, does not serve. Tulak turned his head slightly, but did not face him. The apprentice slowly approached the flame at the chamber's center, a quiet, living ember that had burned since the fortress was first raised. He held his weapon over it. The metal glowed dull red, then brightened, then softened. In seconds, the blade that symbolized his power was nothing but molten steel. It dripped into the basin beneath the flame, hissing softly. Tulak listened. He understood. The apprentice was not giving up. He was beginning again. He knelt behind Tulak, not in obedience, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. The first true acknowledgement since he had entered the chamber. "I was wrong," the apprentice said quietly. "You are not weakened." Tulak closed his eyes. For a moment, he felt the echo of a memory, one of his own voice, long ago, saying nearly the same words to a master who no longer heard him. He opened his eyes again. The apprentice continued, "You are incomplete." Not an insult, a truth. A truth only someone who watched too closely could see. Tulak finally turned to face him. The apprentice met his gaze without trembling, not with challenge, with understanding. The kind that only forms between two people connected by violence, silence, and years of unspoken lessons. "You cannot feel the force the way you once did," the apprentice said. "You cannot dream. You cannot rest. Your body endures what it shouldn't. And yet..." He looked down at the molten metal cooling in the basin. "You still stand." The chamber felt tighter. The fortress listened. The moments stretched between them, neither breaking it. Tulak stepped forward. He placed one hand on the apprentice's shoulder, the smallest gesture, but more than he had given anyone in years. His touch was cold, steady, empty in ways even the apprentice could not understand. "You will rise," Tulak said. Not encouragement, a prophecy. The apprentice looked up. "And you?" Tulak's eyes shifted toward the floor, as if sensing the crack beneath the throne deep below, the place where the ritual had taken something from him that could not be returned. "I remain, not by choice, by consequence." The apprentice bowed his head once more, not in loyalty, but in respect, and turned toward the exit. He paused in the doorway, looking back at Tulak standing alone in the failing torchlight. "Master," he said softly, "one day I will return with a blade worthy of ending you." Tulak did not answer. He didn't need to. The fortress answered for him. It exhaled a long, cold breath that rolled through the chamber like a warning whispered by stone. The apprentice left. His footsteps faded, and Tulak Hord stood in silence, knowing the truth. The blade had not chosen the apprentice. It had not chosen the master. It had chosen the future, and in that future, one of them would fall. It began without a declaration. There was no warning, no broadcast, no formal orders delivered to the Sith fleets, just movement, a slow, steady shift across the outer rim. One world at a time, like stepping stones swallowed by shadow. And at the center of it, old Tulak Hord. He no longer needed to sit on a throne, he was the throne. Wherever he stood, the galaxy reshaped itself. The Sith Lords beneath him obeyed without question, not because they feared death, but because they feared his silence. He did not rally with speeches. He did not promise glory. He gave only direction. And the dark side followed. The campaign had no name. Not at first. Only later would historians call it the War of 1,000 Tombs, because none of the planets Tulak conquered were left alive. They were buried, cities collapsed into themselves. Libraries turned to ash. Jedi outposts fell quiet. Entire lineages ended with no record they ever existed. He started with the forgotten colonies, the ones too far from Coruscant to matter. Places once held by neutral systems, fringe force sects, and exiles. Places that remembered the old Sith empires as myths. Tulak made them real again. His fleet was not the largest, but it moved like a single breath, sharp, cold, without pause. His soldiers were not the most numerous, but they fought like echoes of his will, unbreakable, remorseless, unseen. What frightened the galaxy most was not the speed of his campaign. It was its silence. No survivors. No transmissions. No reports of retreat or resistance. Just long dead signals, severed mid-word. The Republic noticed too late. By the time they gathered intelligence, 8 worlds had vanished. Not destroyed, erased. No orbital debris. No planetary ruins. Just smooth scars in the Force, as if the worlds had been scraped clean by something that refused to leave fingerprints. The Jedi Council sent scouts. None returned. One Jedi Knight, Taran Olos, a quiet seer once stationed on Renvar, sent a final message before disappearing. Her words arrived as a broken whisper. There is something moving between systems. Not a fleet, not even a man. A shadow. It sees through stone. It moves without wind. And when it passes, then silence. Her body was never found. Across the stars, whispers began to spread. They said Tulak didn't just kill Jedi. He consumed them, drained them of memory, of meaning. That he carved their names into walls with their own bones and buried their voices beneath his fortress. That he didn't conquer to rule, he conquered to remove. His generals never questioned it. They didn't know why they obeyed. Only that they couldn't imagine disobeying. One of them, a Sith commander named Dalen Vru, tried to delay an assault on a neutral moon. He claimed the target held no strategic value. The next day, he walked into the center of Tulak's command chamber and removed his own tongue. No one asked why. They understood. Tulak did not lead with threats. He led with inevitability. And for a time, the galaxy forgot how to resist. Because resistance required memory. And memory was what Tulak took first. The Jedi had faced darkness before. They had fought Mandalorians on the Outer Rim, faced Sith Lords with names like fire and poison. They had stood their ground on battlefields soaked with blood, watched temples burn, watched each other fall. But this war was different. Because in this war, Jedi didn't fall. They disappeared. It began with whispers. A lost knight here, a missing watchman there. At first, the Order assumed they had turned fallen to anger, seduced by war. But when the bodies were never found, when the names were erased from the archives by unknown hands, they knew something older was moving in the dark. Tulak Hord didn't fight like a general. He hunted like a phantom. He didn't send fleets to the front lines. He sent silence ahead of him and let it consume. Whole enclaves would wake to find one of their number missing, no sign of struggle, no break in the perimeter. Just an empty bedroll, a cold cup of tea, a lightsaber left where it had always been. One by one, Jedi began to feel it. The chill before sleep, the pause in meditation. The sense that something had begun watching them from across systems, not through comms or sensors, but through the Force itself. And then they were gone. Tulak's power was no longer just destruction. It was absence. He developed a technique never recorded, never taught, that allowed him to sever a Jedi from the Force before they died. Not permanently, just long enough to take something from them. It began with fear, then memory, then breath. When they finally perished, they did not become one with the Force. They simply stopped. On Ossus, the Jedi sent a strike team to intercept him. 5 masters, 7 knights. They never made contact. Days later, a transmission arrived, one image, burned into the frequency with dark side energy. 12 Jedi robes arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, a single hand, still warm, still twitching. None of the council spoke for a full day after receiving it. Tulak had sent a message, not one of power, one of precision. The war no longer looked like war. No front lines, no sieges, just vanishings, just voids, just places where the light used to live. The Jedi began sealing temples, locking archives, hiding students in remote star systems. They buried holocrons, changed star charts, erased their own histories as if forgetting themselves might protect them from being forgotten by him. But it didn't stop. Tulak didn't need their names. He followed their fear. He moved between hyperspace currents like breath between words, appearing on dead moons, ancient stations, derelict shrines, places the Jedi once used to commune with the Force. He turned each one into a tomb. And in every tomb, he left behind carvings. Not of victory, of silence. Symbols that carried no meaning unless you had touched his mind. Unless you had seen what he became. The Jedi called for aid, but few answered. Republic senators debated. Military commanders hesitated. By the time votes were cast, more Jedi had vanished. Tulak wasn't conquering for territory. He was conquering for certainty. To ensure no one who could oppose him would still remember how. And so the Jedi began to vanish. Not from defeat. From the kind of fear that doesn't scream. The kind that hides. The kind that watches every shadow and forgets which ones were real. World by world, Tulak Hord carved his empire into the galaxy like a wound that refused to heal. Not through treaties. Not through rule. Through removal. He did not leave behind governors or overseers. He did not install new Sith Lords to watch over conquered territories. He simply took what he wanted and left nothing that could remember him. His empire grew not as a structure, but as an absence, a map of systems that no longer had a voice. Some planets resisted. They died faster. One world tried to bargain, offering titles, slaves, forbidden technology. Tulak accepted their surrender. Then he ordered his fleet to turn the oceans into steam. The clouds rained boiling water for 3 days. When the storms cleared, the cities were empty shells hollowed out by heat and silence. Another world, a fortress moon once protected by Jedi, launched its entire defense fleet at him. Hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers. Tulak didn't fire a single shot. He boarded their command vessel alone, walked through the corridors without raising his blade, and wiped every mind he touched clean of memory. The ships drifted for days, crew wandering like ghosts, unable to recall why they had come. A third world collapsed when he simply stepped onto its surface. The Force recoiled through its crust, fracturing the ground beneath his feet. The planet shook for hours. When it finally stilled, its temples lay buried under rubble, their archives crushed. It was said Tulak didn't conquer systems. He emptied them. His armies followed, planting banners into soil that had no life left to resist. They believed they were building a new Sith future, a dominion that would outlast the light itself. They praised Tulak as a war god, a phantom who walked between battles untouched. They whispered that he could not die. Many believed he had already died once. They weren't wrong. But they didn't understand what that meant. Every victory left Tulak quieter, emptier. His generals noticed. The more worlds he conquered, the less present he seemed. His gaze drifted. His footsteps made no sound. He stood on command decks for hours without moving, as if forgetting he had a body at all. He no longer interacted with his soldiers, no longer corrected their failures. He simply watched. And the empire grew in the shape of that watching. A shape without mercy, without memory, without purpose beyond momentum. There came a moment quiet, unmarked, when Tulak realized he no longer remembered the faces of the Jedi he had killed. Their names had once burned in his mind, trophies carved in thought. But now, when he tried to recall them, he saw only the spaces they left behind. He wondered if that was victory or decay. His fortress grew colder as the war continued. The rooms that once whispered now echoed nothing. The walls no longer reacted to his presence. The chains no longer rattled. Even the library beneath the throne had fallen silent. The voices inside it, the memories of the dead, no longer pressed against his mind. They avoided him, as if even the dead feared what he had become. Tulak did not slow his campaign. He didn't know how. His body did not tire, his voice did not shake, but his mind drifted. He stood on battlefields as buildings fell, as armies broke, as Jedi made their last stands. But he felt none of it. He walked through the ashes as if he were part of the smoke. His generals believed this was enlightenment. They were wrong. This was loss. Piece by piece, Tulak was losing the one thing even the Sith should never surrender: the sense of who he had been. The galaxy called it empire. He called it a graveyard. And each new tomb he built was another piece of himself laid to rest. It was the last campaign. Not because there were no more worlds to conquer. Because Tulak Hord had no more left to lose. The Jedi called it the Bastion of Ulmaris, an ancient enclave built on a mountainside high above the clouds, older than the Republic, carved by hand before hyperspace lanes had reached the system. It had no weapons, no army, just knowledge and hope. The Order believed it could not be found. It was. Tulak did not send scouts. He simply walked, alone. His fleet remained in orbit, waiting for a signal that never came. He climbed the steps in silence, each one carved with Jedi teachings: patience, serenity, clarity. The words meant nothing to him now. Not because he rejected them. Because he no longer remembered what they felt like. The Jedi stationed inside did not resist. They meditated. They opened the gates. And they waited. Tulak entered without raising his blade. The Force trembled, not from rage, but from recognition. The masters inside had felt him long before his arrival, a wound in the galaxy that had grown too deep to heal. They did not attempt to kill him. They attempted to speak to him. "You are not what they say you are," one whispered. "You are not gone," said another. But Tulak said nothing. Because he didn't know what he was anymore. He moved through the temple like breath through a dying flame. He touched no walls, lifted no weapon. But with each step, the Jedi around him collapsed. Not in pain, in stillness. Some wept. some vanished. Some simply went quiet, their presences extinguished, not destroyed. By the time he reached the center of the sanctuary, there was no one left. He stood before a statue of a Jedi from a forgotten time. The inscription at its base had been worn away, unreadable. Tulak reached out and felt nothing. Not silence, not darkness, just nothing. And in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt his knees give way. He fell, not from exhaustion, not from harm, from understanding, because as the last Jedi presence faded around him, he realized something he had never prepared for. He had won. Completely. There was no one left to defy him. No temple left to burn. No apprentice left to teach. No blade left to stop him. And he felt nothing. No triumph. No peace. Only the weight of the silence he had created. He remained in the sanctuary for 3 days, unmoving, breathing, but barely, waiting for something to rise in him: rage, joy, grief. But nothing came. The Force did not reach for him. The fortress did not call him back. The war was over. And Tulak Hord was still here. That was the price. Not death, not defeat, continuance. He left the temple on the 4th morning. The skies above Ulmaris were clear. The wind did not carry his name. The mountain no longer remembered the voices it had held for centuries. He returned to his ship without a word. And when he stepped onto the command deck, his generals rose to greet him. He said only one sentence: "It is finished." They didn't ask what he meant. They didn't need to. Because behind him, across the stars, the last echo of Jedi resistance had fallen. And in its place stood Tulak Hord. Alone, unchallenged, unseen. The galaxy believed it had witnessed the final victory of the Sith. It hadn't. It had witnessed the moment Tulak Hord realized there was nothing left to become. And in that moment, he began to disappear. At first, he thought it was victory. The silence, no alarms, no transmissions, no Jedi minds reaching through the Force. The galaxy no longer whispered of rebellion, resistance, or war. Even in the farthest systems, even on worlds where his banners had never flown, Tulak Hord felt stillness. He stood at the edge of his throne room and waited. But nothing answered. It had been months since he last left the fortress. The fleet moved on its own. His war machine still functioned. The last Jedi enclaves had been turned to ash, their temples sealed, their names removed. He had no need to kill anymore, because there was no one left to threaten him. And yet something inside him had begun to shift. Tulak Hord had spent a lifetime mastering voices. He had bent Sith rituals to his will, heard the screams of prisoners turned into power, listened to spirits call from ancient tombs. The Force had once poured into his mind like a storm, but now it didn't speak, not in warning, not in guidance, not at all. He closed his eyes and reached for it. Only stillness. It wasn't absence. It was awareness, deep, cold, and complete, as if the galaxy was watching him, waiting for something. But no presence touched his mind, no sound pierced his isolation. Tulak Hord had become a man of silence, and the silence frightened him more than any blade. He ordered the archives brought to him, Sith scrolls from Zayast, holocrons unearthed from the Valley of Golg, forbidden texts once sealed in Jedi vaults. He read them all, not for knowledge, for noise, for anything that could remind him what it felt like to connect. But even the ancient spirits had grown quiet. The holocrons refused to open. The scrolls flaked in his hands, and the shadows in the walls stopped whispering. His servants did not question his moods. They had learned not to. He walked among them as if he were no longer made of flesh. No voice passed his lips. No orders were spoken. They simply felt his intent and obeyed. But even they began to sense something shifting. The halls of his fortress grew colder. The crystals that lined the chamber walls dimmed. The air tasted dry as if the force itself had stopped breathing. Tulak did not sleep. Not because he didn't try. Because sleep no longer came. The force had once carried him into dreams, visions of past wars, of Sith before him, of galaxies yet to fall. But now his mind showed him only blank corridors, empty battlefields, and a throne with no voice behind it. One night, he stood before the viewing window of his sanctum and watched the stars. His hand trembled, not from age, not from fear, from memory. There had once been a child, somewhere in the past, a boy born far from Korriban, whose name had been lost. Tulak could no longer recall his face. But he remembered the first time he touched the force, the first time he felt it stir inside him like fire. Now, that fire was gone. The force had not abandoned him. It had simply gone quiet. Because there was no more to say. Because it had shown him everything. And he had listened. And he had used it. And now, there was only him. One mind in a galaxy of echoes. A dark engine that no longer knew what it was powering. Tulak Hord, the greatest Sith of his age, had silenced the galaxy. And in doing so, had silenced himself. His throne room had no windows. By design, there had been a time when Tulak Hord welcomed light not as comfort, but as contrast. A reminder of what he was unmaking. But as the silence deepened, the fortress sealed itself from the stars. Doors that once opened with his breath now stayed locked. Corridors closed without command. The citadel, once a monument to domination, had become something else. A tomb he was still alive to witness. It had always been alive, in some way. Sith temples weren't structures, they were vessels for power, for memory. Each scream etched into stone. Each ritual embedded in the floor. The fortress had learned from him, grown around him, fed on his voice. But now it began to recoil. Walls he had once shaped by thought resisted his will. The lights dimmed not in reverence, but in warning. Chambers shifted. Doors no longer led to the same places. Rooms appeared where none had existed before, always cold, always empty, and always watching. He did not speak of it, because there was no one left to hear. His servants, once many, had dwindled. Some fled without reason, others stopped moving entirely, their minds broken by rituals too complex for mortal understanding. Tulak did not mourn them. But he noticed. They had begun to vanish faster than he could replace them. He tried reaching into the force again. Still nothing. The silence was no longer passive. It pressed in around him now. It wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of something holding its breath. Tulak wandered his own halls. Not out of curiosity, out of necessity. He was being locked out of his own mind. Memories that once stood sharp and perfect, the names of Sith Lords, the geometry of battles, the texture of ancient blood began to blur. At first, he blamed time. But time had never touched him before. Why now? The answer came from the stones. They remembered. They remembered everything he had done, and more importantly, everything he had forgotten. Each crack in the walls echoed a voice he had buried. Each darkened crystal pulsed with memories that weren't his, or weren't his anymore. In one chamber, he found a mask. His, but he didn't remember crafting it. In another, a scroll written in his own hand, but he couldn't read the script. The fortress wasn't rebelling. It was reflecting, and Tulak could not look away. The central spire began to hum without cause. Vibrations pulsed through the structure like breath, but there was no wind, no movement, just the slow heartbeat of something remembering him better than he remembered himself. At last, he stood before the door to the lower sanctum, the one place he had sealed long ago. Not from others, from himself. It opened without command. And what lay beneath was not a chamber. It was a mirror, a reflection of every moment of conquest, of torture, of domination. Thousands of echoes replayed in flickering fragments. His own voice sometimes proud, sometimes hollow, sometimes screaming. He stepped forward. The fortress trembled, not in defiance, in grief, as if it too now understood. He was not a master, not anymore. He was a relic, a shadow walking holes built from the bones of his memory. And the Force, in its silence, had let him return, to witness what he had built, and to be devoured by it. They began as shapes. At first, Tulak Hord dismissed them, a trick of fading torchlight, a byproduct of rooms shifting, walls realigning, memories surfacing. But the longer he watched, the more consistent they became. They followed no path. They made no sound. But they were always there at the edge of vision, standing where no one stood. Watching him, he didn't speak to them, because they didn't ask for it. These were not spirits, not illusions, not even remnants of Sith long dead. They were impressions, left behind by something older than he was willing to name. The fortress had learned his name, and so had they. Not the name he wore in war, not the one etched on monuments or whispered in battlefields. The one buried beneath it all, the boy who had once climbed the steps of Korriban, believing power would silence his fear. He tried to ignore them, but the shadows had patience and memory. They followed him into the meditation chambers, the halls of bones, the sealed libraries. They did not interfere. They simply waited. Every time he thought of a word, one would vanish. Every time he tried to recall a face, another would appear. It wasn't hostility. It was mourning. They remembered what he had forgotten, and they mourned what he had become. He tried to cast them out through ritual. He drew circles on the floor, burned incense of unknown origin, called on Sith incantations long forbidden, not to summon, but to protect. Not to conquer, but to hide. It didn't work, because they weren't from outside. They were his. Manifestations of every cruelty he had performed with indifference, every apprentice silenced, every planet broken, every voice he ignored when power felt more important than connection. The fortress had remembered, and now so had the shadows. One night, he entered the chamber of fallen blades, a vault he had carved deep within the stone, where the lightsabers of every Jedi he had killed were displayed. It had once been a place of pride. Now, it was silent. Dust covered each weapon. The crystals inside had dimmed. No song of the Force echoed here anymore, just the quiet breath of memory. He stood at the center and waited. And the shadows joined him. They didn't attack. They didn't accuse. They simply stood, hundreds, thousands, faces half-formed, eyes unblinking. They said nothing. Because he had trained them to say nothing, he fell to his knees. Not out of weakness. Out of recognition. These weren't enemies. They were reflections, and in every one of them, he saw a choice. A moment where he could have stopped, could have listened, could have turned back, but hadn't. The shadows knew his name not because they hunted him, but because they had come from him. They were not here to destroy him. They were here to witness the end. The end of a life built on silence. The end of a soul devoured by power. He stayed there until the last shadow faded. He rose without speaking. Because there was nothing left to say. The fortress no longer resisted him. Because it no longer feared him. And Tulak Hord, the most feared Sith in history, now walked the halls not as a master, but as a memory. A ghost watching his own legacy unravel. One shadow at a time. He stopped marking the days. Time no longer moved inside the fortress. The sun outside still rose, moons still shifted, but within these walls nothing changed. And Tulak Hord, conqueror of 1,000 tombs, had become a figure sealed inside his own. The silence no longer waited in corners. It lived with him. It breathed beside him. And it spoke, not in words, but in absence. He wandered without purpose now, not seeking enemies, not seeking knowledge, only passing through rooms that had once meant something. The war chamber, where he had planned the extinction of entire orders. The ritual sanctum, where Sith knowledge had been torn from the Force like blood from a wound. Now, they were empty. Not abandoned. Stripped. Like someone had reached in and taken the meaning. He stood before his throne but did not sit. The seat, carved from obsidian and bone, once welcomed his weight. Now it repelled it. He no longer belonged there. Power, real power, had left him. It had never been stolen. He had consumed it. And it had hollowed him in return. In dreams, when they came, he saw only fragments, not of battles or temples, of things older, a star collapsing, a scream heard before time, a face he had once known, no longer clear. Not enemies, not allies, just echoes. The kind that don't stop after waking. One morning, he found a mirror. Small, dust-covered, forgotten behind a panel in a corridor he didn't remember building. He looked into it, and what stared back was not Tulak Hord, not the warlord, not the Sith. Just a face shaped by memory and scar, eyes too quiet, skin too pale, as if time had not passed but purpose had. He did not recognize it, and that frightened him more than death. He whispered a name, not his Sith title, the one he had buried, the name from long ago, from before Korriban, before the blades, before the silence. But the mirror did not respond. Because the Force no longer listened. Because he no longer listened. And it reflected only that. He returned to the vault of chains, a room so deep and dark even the fortress feared it. He had placed his greatest relics there. Masks, blades, holocrons that even the most devout Sith would not touch. He sat in the center and closed his eyes. No defense, no ritual, just stillness. And the silence embraced him. It did not choke him. It did not punish. It simply accepted, because it knew something he had not. This had never been exile. It had always been the end, not of a body, not even of a mind, but of a voice. Tulak Hord, who had silenced the galaxy, now sat alone in the quiet he had created, not defeated, but dissolved. He had learned every secret, broken every enemy, outlived every rival. But he had forgotten one truth. You cannot conquer the Force. Not truly. You can bend it, shape it, even drown in it. But in the end, the Force remembers what you were before power, and it returns you to that. To silence, to memory, to the parts of you left behind when power felt more important than purpose. The fortress did not collapse. His body did not fade. There was no grand death. No scream. Just stillness. A man alone in a chamber of his own making, listening to the one sound he had spent his life trying to erase. His own. And it was quiet. Too quiet. There was no alarm, no siege, no enemy approaching. When Tulak Hord disappeared, the galaxy didn't shake. It didn't scream. It simply stopped hearing from him. His fortress, buried beneath the cliffs of Dreshtai, remained sealed, the outer gates still pulsed with ancient wards. The inner sanctum obeyed only one voice, and that voice had gone quiet. But inside, he still breathed. At least part of him did. He no longer walked as a warlord, no longer spoke as a master. He had become something else. A figure wandering rooms that remembered who he was, more than he did. They said he had stopped trusting his servants, but that wasn't true. He had stopped trusting time. Too many had betrayed him, yes, but worse were those who had simply died, vanished. Names he could no longer recall, faces that slipped away the moment he tried to remember. The deeper truth was harder to face. He was the last one left. Not of the Sith, of himself. He had left behind so many versions, the slave, the warrior, the conqueror, the alchemist, the god. But now, standing in the core of his own tomb, Tulak Hord felt none of them. He didn't feel anything at all. And still, he waited. For something he couldn't name. For a moment that never came. He moved through shadowed halls built from the bones of enemies. Every echo had once carried the weight of fear. But now, even sound had abandoned him. And with it, purpose. He stepped into a vault one he hadn't entered in years. Not out of fear, but out of something worse. Doubt. There were no lights, no defenses, just a single pedestal, untouched by time. On it sat the only artifact he had never studied. A small cube, humming faintly in the dark. Not a Sith holocron. Not Jedi. Something older. He had taken it from a ruin deep in the unknown regions, a place where even the Force had whispered leave. But he hadn't. He never did. He brought it back and sealed it away. Told no one. Because it spoke. Not in words, but in memories. And tonight, it called again. He reached for it, slowly, as if the air itself resisted. His fingers trembled not from fear, from recognition. Something about the cube felt close, like it had waited for him. He touched it, and the vault vanished. There were no colors, no visions, just a voice, his own. Not the voice he used now, the one from before. Before the titles, before the killings, before the armor. And it asked him one question. Do you remember your name? He staggered back. Not because he couldn't answer, but because he could, and that terrified him. The cube fell silent. The air changed. And Tulak Hord realized something. All this time, he hadn't been alone. The silence, The madness, the fear, it hadn't come from outside. It had been calling from inside, waiting for him to remember. He left the vault in silence, no rage, no power, just a man holding a truth too heavy to speak. He passed the gates of his fortress. One last time, he sealed the doors behind him. No ritual, no guards, no announcement. Just a final, quiet closing. And then, nothing. The greatest Sith Lord of his era was never seen again. Not because he died, but because he stopped needing to be found. He wandered deeper into the fortress. Not to escape, to find the one place he had avoided his entire life, the chamber where his thoughts no longer obeyed him, where the Force echoed strangely, where the walls felt too close as if they were listening. He had built the room himself, carved the stone, cut the channels by hand, placed the runes not as decoration but as warning, because this chamber was not meant for meditation or ritual. It was meant for truth, and Tulak Hord had spent decades avoiding it. He stepped inside. The air tightened, as if recognizing him, as if it had been waiting. The torches lit on their own, though he hadn't summoned fire. They flickered without warmth, casting shadows that moved faster than the flames. He didn't sit. He didn't kneel. He just stood there, breathing slowly, as if each breath tested whether the room still remembered how to hold him. Then it began, a whisper, faint, soft, like the breath of someone standing directly behind him. It spoke in a language he once knew. His language. His first language. Not Sith, not the harsh dialects of Korriban. Something simpler, smaller, from a life buried beneath 1,000 kills and 1,000 victories. He closed his eyes. The whisper came again. Not angry, not pleading, just present. Do you know me? Tulak didn't answer, because he recognized the voice. It wasn't from the Force. It wasn't from the past. It was his, but younger. A voice that had once believed power would fix everything. A voice that had once trembled not from rage, but from fear. He exhaled. The torches dimmed, and the chamber pulled him inward. Not with force, with memory. He saw a boy standing alone on a barren world, staring up at a ship descending from the clouds. He saw hands trembling, not with anger, but with cold. He saw the moment the Sith found him hungry, frightened, desperate for someone to care. He saw himself. Not the Tulak Hord the galaxy feared. The Tulak he had refused to remember. And the voice spoke again. What did you become? He opened his eyes. The room spun, the torches flickered violently, the walls shook. Not from earthquake or battle. From conflict, the kind that happens inside the soul. The kind no blade can cut through. Tulak staggered forward, placing one hand on the wall to steady himself. The stone pulsed beneath his fingers, reacting to his thoughts. He had shaped the fortress, but now the fortress shaped him. It reflected what he had hidden, what he had lost. The whisper grew louder. What did you become? He tried to answer, but the truth lodged in his throat. He remembered the first time he killed, the first time he felt real power, the first time he tasted fear from someone else and realized it filled the emptiness inside him. He had worn it like armor, layer after layer, until he couldn't remember what the emptiness had felt like. And that was the problem. Power had never filled him. It had only covered the void. He stood in the center of the chamber, heart pounding, breath shaking as the younger voice wrapped around him like smoke. "Say my name." He didn't want to. Not because he couldn't remember it. Because he could. Because it hurt. He whispered it. A name small enough to break him. Not Tulak. Not Hord. Just the name from before the darkness. Before the throne. Before the silence. The torches went out. The room fell into total blackness. But Tulak did not fear it. Because for the first time in decades, the darkness finally answered him. Not with power. With recognition. The darkness dissolved slowly. Not with light. With memory. Shapes emerged, first the outline of a corridor he had not walked in years. The cold texture of stone that hadn't warmed since the day he carved it. The faint whisper of wind that didn't belong inside a sealed fortress. Then the mirror appeared. Tall, silent, older than anything he had built. Older than him. A relic he had carried from world to world. Not because he needed it, but because he feared leaving it behind. Fear, even in a Sith, has roots. He stepped closer. The surface didn't reflect him. Not at first. It showed a blur, a shifting shape, caught between shadows. A figure without edges. A presence made of noise. It flickered like a dying flame, pulling itself into form but failing each time. Tulak reached out. The mirror pulsed. And then it focused. A face appeared. Not the face he wore as a conqueror. Not the cold, unchanging mask the galaxy feared. This face was raw, human. Scarred in places he didn't remember being wounded. Eyes dimmer than any holocron's glow. Lips trembling, not with fear, but with exhaustion. It was him. But not the him he believed himself to be. This was the version the Force remembered. The one hidden under decades of ritual, armor, and blood. The mirror spoke, not with a voice, with a realization. He hadn't lost himself. He had buried himself. Buried him so deeply that even victory couldn't reach him anymore. He lifted his hand again, touching the surface. The reflection did not mimic him. It stepped back, as if afraid of him. As if ashamed. He whispered, "Come back." The reflection shook its head. Tulak felt something inside him twist. Not pain, not fear. Something older. Something he hadn't let himself feel since the day he chose power over identity. Loss. The reflection moved again, pointing behind him. Tulak turned. And what he saw made his breath stop. Every mask he had worn throughout his life lined the walls, ceremonial masks, battle masks, ritual masks, faces shaped from bone, metal, stone. Each one holding a fragment of him. Each one whispering an emotion he had tried to erase. Anger, hunger, ambition, fear, loneliness. He stepped toward them. One mask fell from the wall. Without touching it, it hit the ground and shattered into dust. The mirror behind him trembled. Tulak picked up another mask, one he had forgotten. A small one, made when he was an apprentice. A mask he carved the night before his first real duel. It was uneven, flawed, human. He lifted it to his face. The mirror didn't show the mask. It showed the boy wearing it. Eyes wide, heart racing. Desperate to prove himself. Desperate not to be forgotten. Desperate to matter. The mask slipped from Tulak's fingers and broke. The mirror flickered. The reflection changed again, showing the monster he had become. Skin stretched, eyes hollow. A face carved by war, not time. A creature, not a man. The mirror cracked. A thin line. Then another. Tulak stepped closer, placing both hands on the surface. He pushed his strength into it, expecting it to break, expecting the glass to shatter under the weight of his power. It didn't. The cracks healed. The mirror refused to break, because the truth could not be destroyed by force. The reflection whispered not in sound, but in feeling. This is who you are. Not the monster. Not the boy. Both. The mirror showed everything he refused to accept. And it held. Tulak lowered his hands. Not in defeat. In surrender. For the first time in his life, he understood something he had avoided for decades. You cannot kill the self you abandon. It waits, it watches, it returns, and when it does, no power in the galaxy can save you from it. He found the armor exactly where he had left it, resting at the center of his sanctum, cold and waiting, as if it had been watching his journey through the fortress, as if it had known this moment would come. The plates were polished obsidian, etched with symbols older than the Sith, runes that glowed faintly with memories he had tried to forget. It had never been just armor. It had been identity. A shell strong enough to contain the monster he had built himself into. A second skin. A wall between Tulak Hord and whatever name he once carried before the darkness took root. Now, standing before it, he felt small. Not weak. Small. The kind of smallness that comes when a lifetime of power collapses into a single, unbearable truth. He reached out. His hand hovered over the helmet, the mask that had made him legend. A face that did not age. Eyes that never trembled. A mouth that never spoke of doubt. The galaxy feared this mask more than any blade. But he knew its secret. Masks don't hide the truth. They preserve it. He lifted it. The metal felt heavier than he remembered. Not physically, spiritually. As if every soul he had taken, every scream he had silenced, every victory he had stolen had etched itself into the weight. He stared into its hollow gaze. 2 empty eye sockets. 2 silent accusations. He raised the mask toward his face. The cavern around him dimmed. The torches withdrew their light. Even the Force seemed to lean closer. Watching. Waiting. Just before he placed it on, the whisper returned. The one from the mirror. The boy's voice. Is this all you are? His hands shook, because the question wasn't asking for power. It was asking for honesty. He lowered the mask. Slowly, deliberately. For the first time, Tulak Hord refused to hide behind it. He placed it at his feet. The fortress reacted instantly. The walls groaned. The chambers trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling like snow. The old runes flared, unsure how to contain a man unshielded by his own identity. Tulak remained still. He realized something, then something terrifying in its simplicity. The mask hadn't lied to the galaxy. It had lied to him. It had told him he was invincible. It had told him he was eternal. It had told him he was alone because he chose to be. But the truth was carved far deeper. He was alone because power had hollowed him out. Bit by bit. Ritual by ritual. Kill by kill. He looked down at the armor, the legacy he had created. The legacy that had created him. And he spoke a word, so soft the stones almost didn't hear it. His real name. The name from before the screams. Before the conquests. Before the throne. The fortress shuddered one final time. Not in collapse. In acceptance, a pulse of energy moved through the chamber, extinguishing every torch, every ember, every echo. The darkness swallowed him, but it was no longer cold. It was honest. He stepped back from the armor. One step, then another. Each step erased sound, erased presence, erased him. Not as death, as release. His body faded into the shadowed air, dissolving not by force but by surrender. A Sith Lord who had conquered entire systems, killed thousands, broken the Jedi, commanded armies undone not by battle, but by truth. The armor remained, perfect, untouched, as if waiting for someone else, as if it had been left deliberately a relic, a warning, a final memory of the man who no longer needed it. Tulak Hord was gone, not slain, not defeated, gone. And in the silence that followed, the Force whispered the truth of his final hour. You can run from the galaxy. You can run from your enemies. You can run from destiny. But you cannot run from the face you buried. The Sith forgot nothing, but they feared memory more than death. Long after Tulak Hord vanished from the galaxy, his name remained but only as a whisper passed between shadows. It was not spoken in temples, it was not etched into statues. It lived in cracks between stone, in the echoes of tombs that refused to fall silent. Most Sith Lords ruled and were forgotten, but Tulak ruled in absence. His legacy was not written in blood, but in the silence that followed it. And those who dared remember him truly remember him, did not do so in reverence. They did so in fear. For generations, apprentices who wandered too deep into Korriban's catacombs spoke of voices not of pain or command, but of hunger. Cold, patient hunger. The kind that waits behind locked doors, wearing a mask made of memory. They said his teachings were cursed, that every holocron forged in his image bore not just knowledge, but a presence, not alive, not dead, only aware. And even those who craved his power would not speak his name without cost. For to speak it was to open something, not a door, not a tomb, something older, something beneath both. And so the Sith called him many things. The Master of the Forgotten, the silence that devours, the one who waits. But never Tulak, never Hord. Because some names don't echo. Some names listen. Korriban held many tombs, but only one felt unfinished, not incomplete waiting, as if the stone itself expected footsteps that never returned. The architects who carved it left no records. The slaves who hauled its foundations died before speaking a word. Even the Sith historians, so obsessed with lineage and ritual, refused to name the structure. They wrote only a single phrase in the archives: a tomb for the one who will not die. It had no statue, no inscriptions, no victories carved into the walls, only a long, descending corridor that grew colder with each step. Torches burned lower there, as if the darkness consumed flame faster than it consumed air. Some believed the tomb had existed before Tulak Hord. Others whispered that he carved it himself not in stone but in memory, a place he had walked in dreams long before his final hour. No body was ever placed inside, no procession ever marched through its gates. But still, the tomb remained alive with his presence. The Force twisted strangely within it, like a voice struggling to speak through water. Apprentice after apprentice entered, seeking his power. None stayed long. Some ran, some screamed. Some left silent, their eyes unfocused, as if they'd seen a face they too had buried within themselves. The elders forbade entry, but the tomb did not need visitors. It listened, it remembered. It kept the final shape of Tulak's spirit like a shadow pressed into stone. And those who dared descend fully understood the truth. Tulak Hord did not need a grave. The galaxy itself had become one. Not all holocrons are meant to be opened. Some are forged not to teach, but to test. Tulak Hord's holocrons were unlike any the Sith had seen before. They were not repositories of knowledge, but prisons of intent. Each one held fragments of his voice, not instructions, but questions. And not questions meant to be answered, but endured. Those who activated them reported different visions. Some saw endless war. Others saw themselves, standing alone in chambers made of bone, whispering words they didn't know they had learned. A few screamed before they could speak again. Most said nothing. The content was always shifting. Shards of rituals, pieces of dead languages, drawings carved in pain. One artifact in particular, shaped like a jagged pyramid with no clear seams, drove an entire Sith enclave to madness over a single night. The next morning, only silence remained, and the holocron was gone. Some believed these holocrons were never truly recordings. They were Tulak's soul, fragmented and hidden, not to be preserved but to survive, to haunt. It is said that Darth Nihilus once studied one, and found nothing, and yet he would not touch another, not even when offered one by his own followers. He simply turned away, because Tulak Hord's legacy was not meant to be understood. It was meant to be felt, as a sickness, as a hunger, as the echo of a mind that had outlived its body, its name, even its purpose. His holocrons did not teach dark power. They remembered it, and they passed on the burden of that memory to whoever dared listen. The galaxy changed, the Jedi returned, empires collapsed, names faded from stone. But Tulak Hord remained, not in form, not in legend, but in echoes soft and sharp, like a whisper behind durasteel. He lingered in rituals no one remembered starting, in fears that had no face, in tombs built over tombs, where even the Force dared not speak. Long after his body vanished, long after his teachings were buried beneath newer dogmas, his presence persisted, unmarked, unseen, but not forgotten. Sith Lords rose and fell, Marka Ragnos, Naga Sado, Exar Kun. Each one walked paths Tulak had carved in blood. Some claimed they surpassed him, but none walked freely through the tombs he built. None wielded his blade without shivering. None slept soundly beneath the weight of his gaze, carved into the walls of Korriban. Even Darth Bane, father of the Rule of Two, studied him in silence. But he never spoke of what he found, and never returned to the catacombs where Tulak's shadow stretched longer than any light. There were no statues that could capture him, no datachron that could contain him, because Tulak Hord was not just a Sith Lord. He was the hunger between centuries, the reason the Force still stirs on dead worlds, the shape that fear takes when it has no name. And in the darkest corners of the galaxy, in broken vaults, in half-lit temples, in dreams shared by no one, his voice still waits. Not to speak, but to listen. Because somewhere, someone is always searching for power. And Tulak Hord is always watching, when they find it.